Hello guys, welcome to Bald Voldemort. Today we have an incredible story for you. What if Harry Potter lost into the infinite world of Minecraft? If you enjoy the video, please like and subscribe. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The grid beneath the grass. The great hall smelled like smoke and copper, and the particular ozone stink of too much magic thrown too fast in too small a space. And Harry Potter was tired in a way that went past his bones, and into whatever came after bones. Voldemort's wand was up. Harry's wand was up. Everyone else in the world had gone very quiet, the way a room does right before something in it breaks forever. "You know," Voldemort said, and his voice had that awful reasonable calm to it, the tone of a teacher explaining something to a student who was about to fail spectacularly. "You should have died years ago, Harry Potter." "Yeah," Harry said. "I get that a lot." There wasn't time for more banter than that. There was never time for more banter than that. Not really. Not when the words were already leaving both their mouths in the same breath. Avada Kedavra cutting green through the dust-choked air. Expelliarmus answering it with a streak of red that didn't so much collide with the curse as fold into it. The way two rivers meet and neither one wins. They just become a third thing entirely. Harry had felt magic do strange things before. He'd felt the twin cores lock up wand to wand in the graveyard, felt the elder wand refuse to kill its master, felt a Horcrux die inside his own chest like a fever breaking. He knew, on some animal level below language, what powerful magic colliding with powerful magic was supposed to feel like. This didn't feel like that. This felt like the world tearing, not metaphorically, actually tearing, a seam splitting somewhere behind his eyes and behind the walls of the great hall and behind the sky itself. And for one horrible, silent second Harry saw straight through the fabric of everything into something that looked like static, like the room had lost its picture, and was showing him the black and white hiss underneath. Then the floor of Hogwarts simply wasn't there anymore. He didn't fall so much as get unmade and remade somewhere else, stomach lurching up into his throat, his own scream lost in a roar of wind that had no business existing between one blink and the next. Colors strobed past him, too bright, too flat, like a child's drawing come alive. And then there was ground, sudden and total, and Harry hit it hard enough to knock every scrap of breath out of his lungs. He lay there for a long moment, face down in grass, doing the thing you do after you survive something you shouldn't have. Nothing at all, just breathing, just checking piece by piece that his arms worked, his legs worked, his ribs weren't doing anything they oughtn't. Then he opened his eyes and understood that whatever had happened to him, it had not stopped happening. The grass under his hands was green. That much was normal. But it wasn't grass-shaped. It was a flat plane of pure, saturated color that ended in hard right angles, like someone had drawn a square of green on graph paper, and then, impossibly, given it 3 dimensions. He pushed himself up onto his knees and the ground beneath him gave a strange little visual pop, as though his weight had briefly registered as a texture change rather than a physical event. "What?" Harry said, to no one in a voice that came out far steadier than he felt, "is going on?" He stood. His knees didn't wobble, small mercy, and he looked around at a landscape that his brain kept trying to reject and failing. Trees stood in neat, blocky columns, their leaves a uniform, faintly translucent green that hung in perfect cube-shaped clusters, like someone had built a forest out of enormous, mossy dice. The hills rolled in soft slopes, but every slope was made of visible, distinct squares stacked on squares, dirt giving way to stone giving way, here and there, to seams of something that glittered dull gray in cracked patterns. The sky was a flat, cheerful blue with no clouds that moved the way clouds should move. They drifted in straight lines, like they were being dragged on invisible rails. Somewhere behind him, a chicken clucked. Harry turned, wand already coming up on reflex, 30 seconds ago, he'd been fighting for his life against the most dangerous wizard in a century. His body hadn't caught up to the idea that the war might be over, and found himself pointing 11 inches of holly and phoenix feather at a small white bird with a comically oversized yellow beak, standing on legs like toothpicks, its whole body constructed from the same impossible, blocky geometry as everything else. The chicken looked at him. He looked at the chicken. "Right," Harry said. "Okay." He lowered the wand, slowly, the way you'd lower a weapon in front of something that might not actually be a threat, but which you also hadn't fully ruled out. The chicken clucked again and wandered off through the grass, entirely unbothered, and somewhere in the recesses of Harry's mind a very small, very tired voice pointed out that of all the things that had happened to him in his life, being hunted since infancy, watching people he loved die, going nose to nose with death itself, this was possibly the strangest 90 seconds yet, and it had involved a chicken. He turned in a slow circle, taking stock the way Moody had drilled into all of them during the war. Constant vigilance, even here, even now, hills to the north, forest to the west and to the east, a long, flat stretch of pale sand meeting water so blue it looked painted on. No castle, no people, no sound of spellfear, no smell of smoke that wasn't the smoke he'd carried with him from the great hall, still clinging faintly to his robes. Just wind moving through square-leaved trees, and distantly, some kind of low, ambient hum, like the whole world was very quietly running, the way a computer hums when it's on even if nothing on the screen is moving. "Ron would love this," Harry muttered, and then had to stop because saying Ron's name out loud in an empty field made the whole impossible situation suddenly, viciously real in a way the falling and the grass and the chicken hadn't managed. His chest tightened. He thought of Hermione's face right before the curse hit, thought of the Great Hall, thought of Ginny somewhere in the crowd he hadn't had time to look for. He shoved it down. Hard. There would be time to fall apart later, hopefully somewhere with a door he could close. Right now he was standing in an open field in clothes torn from battle, with a wand that had just done something to reality he didn't understand, no idea where he was, and no idea if whatever had ripped him out of the Great Hall could do it again and finish the job properly. First things first, assess the threat level. Second, find shelter. Third, and this one came from somewhere colder and more practical than grief, a lesson 4 years of war had beaten into him without mercy. Find out what kind of place this is before it finds out what kind of person you are. He started walking toward the trees. The forest, once he was inside it, was both more and less strange than it had looked from a distance. The trunks were solid and rough under his palm when he touched one, bark textured in a way that felt almost normal, except that each log was a perfect, repeating square, stacked in units, like someone had built the tree out of enormous Lego bricks, and then somehow made the Lego bricks feel like wood. When he pressed his hand flat against it, he could feel the grain, feel the give of living wood, feel warmth from the day's sun still radiating out of it. It was real, whatever real meant here. It had weight and texture and resistance. It just also, very clearly, did not follow any laws of geometry that Harry recognized. He kept walking, wand loose but ready in his hand, ears straining for any sound that wasn't wind or bird song. He found, after a while, a low outcrop of stone jutting from a hillside, streaked with dark seams of something that glinted almost black in the slanting afternoon light, and beside it, half buried in leaf litter, a scatter of what looked absurdly like small brown lumps, apples, maybe, except square, sitting on the ground beneath a tree whose leaves shimmered faintly red. He picked one up. It sat in his palm, warm from the sun, smelling exactly like an apple tasting, when curiosity got the better of caution, and he took a bite, exactly like an apple, if an apple had been drawn by a very confident child and then somehow made to taste correct. His stomach, which hadn't eaten anything since before the battle began, informed him in no uncertain terms that flavor logic could be sorted out later, and he finished the apple in 4 bites and picked up 2 more before shoving them into what remained of his robes. Then the light shifted. It happened fast, faster than any sunset Harry had ever seen, the flat blue sky bleeding into orange and then disturbingly quickly into a deep star-flecked black, as though someone had reached up and simply swapped one backdrop for another. He'd been in the forest for maybe 2 hours. It felt like the day had lasted 20 minutes, and with the dark came sound, not wind, not birdsong. A low, wet groaning noise, somewhere off to his left, that made every hair on his arm stand on end, not because it was loud, but because of the particular, awful quality to it. The sound of something that had once had lungs and didn't anymore, and was making noise out of pure habit. Harry's wand came up without conscious thought. 4 years of war had taught his body to move faster than his mind could argue with it. "Lumos," he whispered, and the tip of his wand flared into soft white light. What it illuminated made him take an actual step backward. It had the rough shape of a person, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, a torso, but everything about it was wrong in ways that stacked up faster than his brain could process. Its skin was a sickly, mottled green, the color of old bruises. Its clothes hung on it in tattered, blocky strips that looked less like fabric and more like the idea of fabric, rendered crudely. Its mouth hung open in a way no human jaw should, revealing a black cavity where teeth should have been, and its arms swung at its sides with a stiff, mechanical looseness, like a puppet whose strings had been cut halfway. It turned toward the light. Its eyes, if they were eyes, were flat, dark, and utterly without recognition, without fear, without anything Harry could read as thought. It groaned again and started walking toward him. Every part of Harry's training screamed and furious at him, and his body reacted accordingly. He didn't think, he simply moved, wand snapping up into a defensive arc. Incendio! Fire roared out of his wand in a bright orange gout, and here finally was the first thing since he'd landed that behaved exactly the way Harry expected magic to behave. It caught the thing full in the chest, and the creature staggered, letting out a horrible, gurgling shriek that had no business coming from something that clearly wasn't breathing. And then, it didn't die like an infurious died, crumpling into ash and rag. It flickered. That was the only word Harry had for it. Flickered, like a badly tuned television, its blocky green form shuddering between solid and translucent. And then it simply popped, dissolving into a small shower of what looked, absurdly, like gray powder and a scatter of pale, curved fragments that hit the forest floor with a sound like dropped pebbles. Harry stood there, wand still raised, chest heaving, staring at the empty patch of grass where a monster had been standing 3 seconds ago. "Okay," he said out loud into the dark. That was okay. He crouched cautious and picked up one of the pale fragments. It was smooth, curved, faintly ivory-colored. A bone, or the shape of a bone, rendered in the same blunt geometric logic as everything else in this place, but unmistakably meant to be a bone, dropped by a creature that had clearly, until recently, been dead and walking anyway. Wonderful, he thought. A whole new kind of zombie. There was no time to think much further on it, because the groaning didn't stop. If anything, it multiplied, low and wet and coming from at least 3 directions now, joined by a new sound. A dry, clattering rattle like bones shaken in a bag, and with it, the distinct, unmistakable thock of something loosing an arrow. Harry threw himself sideways on instinct, and the arrow that would have taken him in the shoulder instead buried itself in the trunk of a tree behind him with a solid thunk. He came up in a crouch, wand tracking, and his Lumo's light caught the shape of it. White, skeletal, hollow-eyed, standing with terrible steadiness 15 feet away. A crude bow already drawn again, another bone-white arrow nocked and aimed. "Right," Harry said, and dove behind the nearest tree trunk as the second arrow whistled past where his head had just been. "Right, of course, why would it just be zombies?" He leaned out from cover, wand snapping up. "Expelliarmus." The disarming charm caught the skeleton across the ribs. No bow flew out of grasping fingers, no dramatic wrenching free of a weapon. Just a solid, satisfying impact that sent the whole rattling frame of bones flying backward off its feet to crash into a tree. And Harry allowed himself half a second of grim satisfaction before 3 more of the zombie things lurched out of the tree line, drawn by the noise, drawn by the light, groaning with that same awful, mindless hunger. He didn't have time to be afraid. He'd learned, somewhere between the ministry and the graveyard and the astronomy tower, that fear was a thing you dealt with later, in the quiet, in the dark, on your own, not in the middle of a fight, where fear only slowed your wand hand. Confringo. The blasting curse took the nearest zombie in a burst of orange light and sent it flying apart in a spray of gray dust and curved bone-white fragments, and the shockwave of it staggered the 2 behind it just long enough for Harry to pivot, wand already moving into the next spell. Bombarda. A second explosion, smaller but tighter, close range, and another of the creatures popped apart mid-stride, its half-formed reaching hand disintegrating an arm's length from Harry's face. The skeleton he'd disarmed, if that was even the right word for what he'd done, was climbing back to its feet, bow somehow still clutched in bony fingers, and Harry didn't give it the chance to draw again. He crossed the distance in 3 long strides, robe snapping around his legs, and swung his wand like he was swinging a blade. An old trick, more physical than magical. Something Sirius had shown him once in a dueling lesson years and years ago. Sometimes the wand's just a stick, Harry, and sometimes a stick to the face works just fine. And the flat of his wand connected with the skull, with a satisfying crack of bone on bone that sent the whole rattling frame sprawling. "Incendio," he snarled, wand tip nearly touching the fallen skeleton's ribcage. And this time he didn't let the fire flicker out after one burst. He held the spell, poured heat and fury into it the way he'd learned to do against dementors, against despair, against the endless grinding fear of the war, until the skeleton stopped rattling and dissolved into powder and bone shards, and curiously, a single scorched arrow that clattered onto the grass, whole and untouched by the flame that had unmade the creature holding it. Silence, for a moment, just his own ragged breathing, the crackle of dying fire at the tip of his wand, and the distant, patient groan of more zombies somewhere in the dark, not close enough yet to be an immediate threat, but close enough that Harry knew this wasn't over. He looked down at his hands. They weren't shaking. That surprised him a little distantly, the way small true things sometimes surprised him in the middle of chaos. 4 years ago, a single boggart had made his hands shake. Now he just fought off 4 monsters in an unfamiliar world, with a wand that had apparently torn him out of his own dimension, and his hands were steady as stone. I suppose that's what the war did to me, he thought, and didn't examine the thought too closely because it had teeth in it he wasn't ready to look at. "Okay," he said again, out loud, mostly to hear a human voice, even if it was only his own. "Okay, new plan. Find somewhere I can't be snuck up on. Work out what the hell is happening. Then panic if there's time." He picked his way carefully back toward the edge of the forest, wand light held high, watching the shadows the way he'd have watched them on a mission with the Order, every sense stretched thin and sharp. Twice more he heard the wet groan of a zombie somewhere off in the trees, and once the distinct rattle of bone, but nothing came close enough to force another fight, and he broke from the tree line into open, moonlit grassland, with the strange sensation of having survived something without ever fully understanding what it was. The moon, when he looked up, was the wrong shape, not a smooth crescent or full disk, but faintly, unmistakably square at the edges, hanging in a sky scattered with square-cut stars that didn't twinkle so much as sit there, fixed, like pinpricks in dark paper. It should have been the most alarming thing he'd seen all night. Somehow, after the walking corpses and the arrow-shooting skeleton, it barely registered. He found a rise of stone a little way from the trees, not tall but steep-sided, defensible with a shallow overhang that would keep the worst of any weather off him, and he climbed it, wand light still burning, and sat with his back against cold rock and his legs drawn up, and for the first time since the great hall, let himself actually stop. The silence, when it came, was almost worse than the fighting. He didn't sleep. He tried, at first closed his eyes, told himself that whatever this place was exhaustion, and his body needed rest regardless of which dimension it happened to be stranded in. But every time he drifted, he saw green light, heard Hermione's scream cut off mid-syllable, felt the floor of the great hall give way beneath him all over again, and he jerked back awake with his heart hammering, and his wand already half raised against a threat that wasn't there. So instead he sat, and watched the moon crawl its impossibly straight-edged path across the sky, and thought. He thought about the collision of spells, his Expelliarmus, Voldemort's killing curse, the way they hadn't canceled each other out but merged. Hadn't he felt that before? Hadn't the Elder Wand done something similar in the graveyard all those years ago? Some strange resonance between wands and curses that the books never fully explained. He thought about the tearing sensation, the static behind the world's skin, and wondered, with the detached, clinical part of his mind that had learned to keep functioning even when the rest of him wanted to scream, whether he'd been sent somewhere, or simply fallen through a crack that would have opened regardless of who was standing near it. Wondered whether Voldemort had fallen through too, was out there somewhere in this same blocky, impossible world, and felt his stomach turn cold and tight at the thought. He thought about Hogwarts, about the battle, about everyone he'd left behind mid-fight without so much as a goodbye, and made himself stop thinking about that, because there was nothing useful in it, only grief, and grief could wait. Mostly, though, he thought about his wand. Because something had happened when he cast tonight, something subtle that he'd been too busy surviving to fully notice until now, sitting still with nothing to do but pay attention. The confringo that had blown apart the zombie, it had come out faster than it should have, hotter, with none of the slight drag he usually felt when casting a spell he hadn't used recently. The incendio had burned longer, brighter, with less effort than it usually took to sustain. Even the Expelliarmus, which should have simply knocked the bow from bony fingers, had instead hit with a physical force more like a battering ram than a disarming charm. It was as though the world itself were reinterpreting his magic, not weakening it, not fighting it, but translating it into whatever rules governed this place, and in doing so, amplifying it, or at least changing its shape into something new. Like his spells were words in a language this world didn't quite speak, and so the world was doing its best to substitute in words of its own that meant something close enough. He held his wand up in front of his face, turning it slowly in the moonlight. "What are you doing to me?" he murmured, not really expecting an answer. He got one anyway, not from the wand but from the world. A soft, chiming sound, high and clear and utterly out of place against the low groan still drifting up from the dark forest below, and with it, a flicker of something at the very edge of his vision, like a line of pale blue light hovering just above where his hand held the wand, gone again before he could focus on it properly. Harry blinked, looked again. Nothing there. Tired, he told himself. You're exhausted and half in shock, that's all that was. But it happened again 20 minutes later, when a spider the size of a large dog, black, multi-eyed, moving with a horrible, skittering silence, came scuttling up the slope toward his little outcrop, and Harry's stupefy caught it mid-leap and sent it tumbling backward down the hill in a stunned heap, and there it was again. That flicker of pale light, and this time for just a fraction of a second before it vanished. Harry could have sworn he saw words in it. Numbers. Something like +3 hovering where the spell had struck, gone as fast as it came. "I am losing my mind," Harry said flatly, to the empty air, and the empty air did not disagree with him. Still, he didn't sleep, and the night stretched on in slow, careful increments, and twice more he had to deal with wandering zombies that got too close for comfort, dispatching them with efficient, economical blasts of confringo that he was careful now to watch closely. And each time, that same flicker of pale light and half-formed numbers hovered at the edge of his sight before fading. By the time the sky began to lighten, again impossibly fast, the transition from black to gray to full daylight happening across what felt like 10 minutes rather than a proper dawn, Harry had stopped being surprised by the numbers and started, cautiously, testing them. He aimed his wand at a patch of empty grass a few feet away and murmured, "Incendio," watching carefully this time, forcing himself to focus past the discomfort of watching for something that shouldn't exist. The grass caught fire, ordinary enough, but hovering above the small blaze, faint and blue and only visible if he looked slightly to the side of it rather than straight at it, was a string of characters that resolved after a moment of squinting into something almost like fire aspect eye, duration extended. He stared at it until it faded. "You're joking," he said. "You're actually joking." He tried again, this time aiming at nothing in particular and simply casting lumos, and the flicker of blue light that answered this time read briefly, luminous aura, radius increased, before dissolving. It was as if the world had decided, no, not decided, that implied intent, and Harry wasn't ready to assume intent yet, as if the world had simply categorized his magic, filed it into slots that made sense to whatever logic ran underneath the blocky trees and the square moon and the strange chiming half-visible text, translating fire-making spell into something closer to an enchantment, a property, a rule the world itself could hold on to and apply consistently. He thought of enchanted swords in old stories, flaming blades, freezing arrows, that sort of thing. Thought distantly of Fred and George's endless fascination with magical items that did one specific powerful thing over and over without a wand at all. Is that what's happening to me, he thought? Is my magic becoming an enchantment? A property of the world instead of a spell I have to keep casting from scratch. It should have frightened him, probably. The idea that his magic, the single most consistent, controllable thing in his entire chaotic life, was being rewritten by forces he didn't understand, in a world he hadn't chosen, without so much as asking his permission. Instead, sitting there on cold stone with the too-fast sun rising over an impossible geometric horizon, Harry Potter felt something he hadn't felt in longer than he wanted to admit. He felt curious. The second day, he explored properly. He was careful about it, cautious in the way war had taught him to be cautious, moving from cover to cover, keeping his wand ready, watching the tree lines and the shadows of overhangs for the telltale groan or rattle that meant trouble. But daylight, it turned out, was a different world entirely from the one he'd survived through the night. The zombies were gone, or at least hidden. He found, eventually, that they seemed to burn in direct sunlight, catching fire with small, startled shrieks if they were caught out from under cover when the sun rose, which explained rather neatly why the previous night's horde hadn't simply followed him up the hill and finished the job. The skeletons did the same. Whatever they were, whatever animated them, they were creatures of the dark, bound by rules as rigid and strange as everything else in this place. Daylight brought other things, though. He found a small herd of what could only be described as cows, blocky, black and white, chewing grass with placid indifference to the wizard creeping past them with his wand out. And beyond them, cresting a low hill, his first proper look at running water. A river, wide and slow, its surface catching the sun in a way that looked almost normal, almost like water was supposed to look, right up until he got close enough to see that it, too, moved in strange, blocky increments, currents shifting invisible, discrete steps rather than smooth flow. He knelt at the bank and drank from cupped hands, and it tasted like water. Cold and clean and entirely real. It was while refilling his makeshift water supply he'd found in his robe pockets of all impossible things, his emergency supplies from the battle still miraculously intact, a spare vial, a scrap of dittany-soaked bandage, 3 sickles and a nut that were entirely useless here, that he heard it. Not a groan, not a rattle. A voice. Human. Distant. Panicked. Harry was moving before he'd finished processing the sound, wand already in hand, cutting through underbrush toward the source with the same instinctive, unhesitating speed that had carried him through 5 years of war. He crested a low ridge and looked down into a shallow valley and found, for the first time since he'd landed in this world, another person. Not exactly a person, he corrected himself half a second later, because there was something faintly, unmistakably off about the figure stumbling backward across the valley floor, away from a small cluster of the zombie things that had apparently, unlike their nocturnal cousins, either survived the sunlight by clustering in the shade of a rock overhang or simply hadn't been caught by dawn in time. The figure was human-shaped, wearing a rough brown robe not unlike something a monk might wear, with an oddly elongated nose and wide, slightly too large eyes, backing away with his hands raised in a gesture that was unmistakably, universally please don't hurt me, even though the creatures shambling toward him clearly had no capacity to understand pleading of any kind. "Oh, for God's sake," Harry muttered and ran down the slope. He didn't bother with subtlety. There wasn't time for subtlety, and honestly, after the night he'd had, he wasn't sure he wanted subtlety. Confringo. The first zombie went up in a spray of gray dust and bone shard, mid-lurch. Bombarda. The second staggered sideways from the force of the blast, and Harry closed the distance and finished it with a short, vicious swing of his wand across its skull. The same trick from the night before, bone cracking against bone until the thing dissolved. The third turned toward him, groaning, arms outstretched, and Harry simply didn't bother with a spell at all, stepped in close, caught its wrist as it grabbed for him, and used its own momentum to swing it bodily into the rock overhang with a crunch that ended the fight without a single word of Latin. Silence again. The strange figure in the brown robe stood frozen against the rock face, staring at Harry with those 2 wide eyes, mouth slightly open, making a small, uncertain sound that wasn't quite words. "You're all right," Harry said, lowering his wand, trying to sound reassuring and probably failing, given that his voice still had the flat, clipped edge it always got right after a fight. "They're gone. You're okay." The figure blinked at him. Made the sound again, a low, nasal hum, almost musical, definitely not English, definitely not any language Harry recognized, and then slowly, cautiously lowered its hands. "Can you understand me?" Harry asked, feeling faintly ridiculous even as he said it. The figure tilted its head, studied him for a long moment with an expression that was, disconcertingly, entirely readable despite the strange proportions of the face it belonged to, wariness, then something like calculation, then unmistakably relief, and said, in a voice that was heavily accented but entirely, gloriously comprehensible, "You are not from here." Harry actually laughed. It surprised him, the sound escaping before he could stop it, short and a little cracked around the edges, the first laugh he'd managed since falling into this world. "No," he said. "No, I'm really, really not." The villager, because that was clearly what he was, Harry realized, taking in the brown robe, the calm, agricultural bearing of him now that the panic was fading from his strange wide eyes, something in his manner that read as farmer or trader rather than warrior, studied him a moment longer, glanced at the wand still held loosely in Harry's hand, and then said something that made every hair on the back of Harry's neck stand up all over again, though not from fear this time. "You fight like the ones who fall from the sky," the villager said slowly, working the unfamiliar words out with visible effort. "The ones the End King hunts." Harry's stomach went very still. "There have been others," he said. "It wasn't a question. Others like me, from wherever I fell from." The villager nodded, slow and grave, and glanced almost fearfully toward the horizon, toward hills Harry hadn't explored yet, toward whatever direction the End King apparently lived in. "Some," the villager said. "Long ago, not many left now." "Why not?" The villager's strange, wide eyes met his, and there was something old and tired and afraid in them that Harry recognized immediately, because he'd seen that exact expression on faces back home, on the faces of people who'd lived through war and lost too much of it. "Because the king finds them," the villager said simply, "and the king does not like to share his world." Somewhere behind them, distant but unmistakable, a low horn sounded across the valley, not the groan of a zombie, not the rattle of a skeleton, but something deliberate, something with intelligence behind it, a call that made the villager flinch and grab instinctively at Harry's sleeve. "That is not good," the villager said. "That is a raid horn. We should not be here when they come." Harry looked toward the sound, then back at the trembling villager beside him, and felt something settle into place inside his chest, something that had been unmoored since he'd landed here, something that finally had a shape and a direction again. "Right," he said, and there was a grim, familiar edge to his voice now, the one that had carried him through 5 years of a war he hadn't asked for either. "Lead the way, then. Let's see what a raid looks like." The villager stared at him like he'd gone mad. Harry just smiled, thin and sharp, and started walking toward the sound of the horn. Chapter 2. The village of Absalom. The villager's name, Harry learned within the first 2 minutes of walking, was Absalom, and he talked the way some people breathed, constantly and mostly to fill silence he found uncomfortable. "You should not go toward the horn," he said, for the 3rd time, jogging half a step behind Harry's longer stride. "It is not clever. Clever men run away from horns." "I've never been particularly clever then," Harry said. "Which way?" Absalom made a small, despairing noise and pointed east, down through a shallow cut in the hills where the grass gave way to a dirt path worn smooth by years of footsteps, and Harry adjusted course without slowing, wand still loose in his hand. Senses stretched thin the way they always went right before a fight, that particular quality of alertness that made the whole world seem to sharpen at the edges, colors and sounds arriving a half-second more vivid than they should. They came over the last ridge together, and Harry got his first look at the village of Absalom's people, and it took his breath away for reasons that had nothing to do with the wooden fences, or the little cottages with their pitched roofs, or the neat rows of farmland laid out in the sunlight. It took his breath away because it was so achingly, painfully normal, a small huddle of homes, a well at the center, a bell tower, chickens scratching in dirt yards, the whole picture book idea of a peaceful settlement, and it was under attack. Figures in gray and dark cloaks moved between the houses, some carrying crossbows, others wielding wicked-looking iron axes, and even from this distance Harry could hear the screaming. "Right," he said, and any doubt he might have had about whether to get involved evaporated instantly, the way it always did, the way it had evaporated every single time in his whole life someone had needed help, and he'd been standing close enough to give it. "Stay behind me." "I was already planning to," Absalom said faintly, but Harry was already running. He came down the slope at a dead sprint, boots skidding on loose dirt, and the first raider to notice him, a lean, hooded figure with an iron axe, standing over a villager who'd fallen and was scrambling backward across the grass on hands and heels, didn't even manage to turn around before Harry's spell hit him. Stupefy. The stunning charm slammed into the raider's back and sent him flying face first into the side of a cottage, with a crunch of impact that would have worried Harry, in another life, in a world with rules he understood, except that same flicker of pale blue light bloomed at the point of contact, and words hung there for half a second before fading. Knockback aye. The raider slumped, unconscious, against the wall, and the villager he'd been about to kill scrambled up and fled behind Harry without a backward glance. There wasn't time to feel smug about it. Two more of the hooded figures had turned at the sound, crossbows swinging up, and Harry didn't wait to find out how much it would hurt to be shot with whatever passed for an arrow in this world. Protego. The shield charm bloomed in front of him, a shimmering, faintly blue dome of force, and the two crossbow bolts that would have taken him in the chest instead struck the barrier and simply stopped, hanging in the air for a heartbeat before dropping to the grass, spent. Harry advanced through his own shield, keeping it up with the stubborn, practiced will he'd built defending against Death Eaters for years, and the raider's eyes, flat, dark, unnervingly similar to the eyes of the zombies from the night before, but with something colder and more calculating behind them, widened just slightly, the first sign Harry had seen in this entire world that a creature here was capable of surprise. Expelliarmus. The nearest crossbow tore itself out of gray-gloved hands and spun end over end into a nearby fence. Confringo. The blasting curse took the second raider square in the chest and sent him sprawling backward through a wooden gate that shattered into splinters under the impact. The village square, when Harry reached it properly, was chaos, villagers screaming and scattering, a handful of the raiders converging from different directions with axes and crossbows, and in the center of it all, standing his ground with a kind of stubborn, doomed courage that made something ache in Harry's chest, was an enormous, blocky figure made of what looked, unmistakably, like solid iron, swinging massive fists at a group of 3 raiders circling it like wolves around a wounded bear. "That's an iron golem," Absalom's voice said from somewhere behind him, breathless, having apparently decided that following Harry into a battle was marginally safer than being alone outside of one. "He guards the village. He is very brave. He is also very slow, and there are more raiders than usual this time." "How many more?" "I do not know. I do not count raiders, I run from them. That is generally the more successful strategy." A crossbow bolt whistled past Harry's ear close enough that he felt the wind of it, and he spun toward the source and found himself facing a raider unlike the others. Taller, its cloak a deeper, richer black, a strange banner mounted on a pole strapped across its back, a crude standard made of some dark, woven material, and a scattering of what looked like carved skulls. And the moment Harry's eyes landed on it, he understood, with a sinking feeling that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with grim recognition, that this was the leader. The other raiders seemed to move differently around it, faster, more coordinated, drawing themselves up into something that looked almost like formation, and the banner-bearer raised its crossbow toward Harry with slow, deliberate menace. "You're in charge, then," Harry said, not really expecting an answer, mostly talking to buy himself half a second to think. "Lovely. Let's sort this out quickly, shall we?" The banner-bearer didn't answer in words. It simply fired. Harry's protego caught the bolt an inch from his collarbone, and in the half-second the shield bought him, he took stock the way Moody had taught him, not of the enemy in front of him, but of everything around it, every angle, every escape route, every villager still caught in the open, and made a decision that 4 years ago would have terrified him and now came as naturally as breathing. He stopped defending and started ending it. Bombarda Maxima. He'd only cast the stronger version of the blasting curse a handful of times in his life. It took more out of him than the ordinary bombarda, more concentration, more will. But the surge of pale blue light that erupted from the tip of his wand this time carried with it a string of half-formed text he didn't have time to read properly. Only caught the shape of something like area effect, radius 4, and the explosion that followed didn't just hit the banner bearer. It hit the two raiders flanking it, and the section of wooden fence behind them, and threw all three bodies backward in a spray of splinters and torn cloth, the banner itself snapping free of its pole and fluttering to the ground like a shot bird. Silence, for a moment, in that corner of the village. Just smoke drifting up from where the explosion had scorched the grass black, and the distant sound of the iron golem still grinding its fists into the last of the raiders near the well, and Harry's own ragged breathing. Then the villagers started cheering. It caught him off guard. Honestly, the sound of it, human voices rising in relief and gratitude rather than fear. A sound he hadn't heard directed at him in longer than he wanted to think about. Not since the celebrations right after Voldemort's downfall that he'd never quite gotten to enjoy, because the grief of everyone lost had drowned out every scrap of joy. He turned, wand still raised out of pure habit, and found a dozen wide-eyed, long-nosed faces staring at him from doorways and behind overturned carts, and one small figure, a child. He realized with a lurch. A child, here in this impossible world. Proof that whatever this place was, it held entire lives and families and futures, came running out from behind a well and threw both arms around Harry's leg before anyone could stop her. "Oh," Harry said, entirely thrown, and looked down at the small villager child clinging to him with the same wide, dark eyes as Absalom, and something in his chest, which had been clenched tight and cold since the moment he'd fallen through the fracture, loosened just slightly, just enough to hurt in a different way than grief hurt. "She says thank you," Absalom translated, arriving at Harry's side slightly out of breath. "Her name is Nell. Her father is the one you saved from the axe. He is currently having what I believe you would call a moment behind that cart." Harry looked over and saw a villager man sitting heavily on the ground, both hands pressed over his face, shoulders shaking, and understood exactly what kind of moment that was, because he'd had several of them himself, back home, back before all of this, in the aftermath of near misses that hadn't gone the way they easily could have. "He'll be all right," Harry said mostly to himself, and gently extracted his leg from Nell's grip, crouching down to her level with the careful, practiced gentleness of someone who'd spent time around frightened children before. "You're safe now. It's over." Nell said something in that same musical, nasal language he couldn't understand, and Absalom translated with a faint smile. "She wants to know if you are a hero from the old stories." Harry thought about the Great Hall, thought about all the people who'd called him a hero over the years and what it had cost every single time, and how little the word had ever actually helped. "No," he said finally, "just someone who happened to be nearby." The iron golem, it turned out, had survived the raid with what Absalom cheerfully described as a bit of a dent, a fact he seemed to find far less concerning than Harry did, given that the dent in question was a fist-sized crater in the golem's chest plate that had clearly come from an axe blow strong enough to fell a tree. The great construct simply stood in the square once the last raider had fled or fallen, arms hanging at its sides, an expression on its blocky iron face that Harry could have sworn, despite having no right to read expression into a face built from cast metal, looked something like patient exhaustion. "He does not speak," Absalom explained as they walked the perimeter of the village checking for stragglers, Nell trailing a respectful few paces behind them now, apparently having appointed herself Harry's shadow for the foreseeable future. "He does not need to eat or sleep or complain, though I think if he could complain, He would complain most days. He was made by the village elders many years ago before I was born to protect us. He has done a good job of it. Until today, when there were more of them than usual and they had a captain with them. The one with the banner. Yes, a raid captain. They do not usually come this far from the outposts unless something has stirred them up. Absalom paused at the edge of the well, glancing east, toward hills that rolled away toward a horizon hazed faintly gray, as though something distant was burning, or had burned recently, and there was a tightness around his strange, wide eyes that hadn't been there a moment before. Something has been stirring a great many things up lately. Such as? Absalom hesitated. It was the first time since Harry had met him that the villager had actually seemed reluctant to talk, rather than simply nervous, and that reluctance, more than anything else he'd said, made the hair on the back of Harry's neck prickle. "Come," Absalom said instead of answering. "You are injured and hungry, and you have been awake through a night and half a day without rest. Whatever questions you have, they will still be questions tomorrow. Let us feed you first." It is very hard to be sensible about danger on an empty stomach, I have found. Harry wanted to press. Every war-honed instinct in him wanted to grab the thread Absalom had just dangled and pull until it unraveled into something useful. Something has been stirring things up, that phrase sitting in his mind like a hook, but he also recognized, distantly, through the haze of exhaustion he'd been ignoring since sunrise, that Absalom was right. He hadn't eaten anything but 3 stolen apples in over a day. He hadn't slept at all, and the last time he tried to push through a battle on pure adrenaline without proper rest, back at the ministry all those years ago, he'd nearly gotten serious killed through his own recklessness, and the memory of that particular failure had never fully stopped weighing on him. "Fine," he said. "Food first, but you're telling me eventually." "Eventually," Absalom agreed in the tone of someone who fully intended to stretch eventually out as long as humanly, or villager-like, possible. The village, once the panic settled, revealed itself to be a small, tight-knit collection of maybe 30 villagers spread across a dozen or so homes, organized around trades in a way that struck Harry as oddly practical the more he paid attention. There was a farmer's row of houses backed onto neat fields of wheat and carrots, and what looked like beetroot. A small forge where a broad-shouldered villager in a leather apron hammered at glowing metal with rhythmic, unhurried strikes. A modest library building with shelves of what turned out, on closer inspection, to be enchanted books that hummed faintly with a magic Harry recognized immediately. Viscerally, as real, not the strange, translated echo of his own spellwork, but something native to this place, its own true source of power. "You have magic here," he said, standing in the doorway of the library staring at shelves of glowing, faintly rippling books that Absalom's people apparently traded and enchanted items with. "Actual magic, not just, whatever's happening to me." "Enchanting, yes," Absalom said, following his gaze. "It is old, older than any of us. We do not fully understand it, the librarians study it, trade knowledge for it, but even they will tell you it came with the world the way stone comes with hills. It is not the same as whatever you do." He glanced at Harry's wand, still holstered at his hip. "What you do is different, wilder. It does not follow the shapes our enchanting follows. It is like watching someone speak a language that should not exist, and somehow the world understands it anyway." "Believe me," Harry said, "I'm just as confused as you are." They ate in Absalom's small cottage. Simple food, bread and some kind of roasted, blocky vegetable Harry didn't recognize, but which tasted, disconcertingly, exactly like a baked potato, along with a rich stew of what turned out to be mutton that Absalom's neighbor had provided with obvious pride in her cooking. And as the too-fast sun began sliding toward evening outside the small square window, Absalom finally, slowly, began to talk. "There have been others," he said again, picking up the thread from earlier that morning, turning a wooden spoon over in his hands without eating. Fallen ones. People like you, who arrive from nowhere speaking languages some of us can somehow understand, carrying powers no villager or illager or piglin ever holds. It does not happen often, perhaps once in a generation. My grandmother spoke of one when she was young, a woman who could summon storms with her bare hands and once flooded an entire ravine to drown a horde of zombies in a single night. What happened to her? Absalom's expression tightened. The End King found her, as he finds all of them eventually. Some he kills outright, some he recruits. My grandmother said the Storm Woman was never seen again after the king's Endermen came for her, but stories persisted, years later, of a terrible new power rising in the far mountains beyond the desert, a power that commanded lightning and never once showed mercy to any village that stood against it. Harry set down his spoon slowly. You think she joined him? I think, Absalom said carefully, that the End King is very patient and very clever, and understands something that most of the monsters in this world do not understand, that fear makes people run, but loneliness makes people stay. And every fallen one who arrives here is, by definition, utterly alone. The words landed with more weight than Absalom probably intended, settling into the raw, unhealed place in Harry's chest that had been aching since he'd woken up in an empty field with no Wandrapair shop, no Order, no Hermione or Ron within reach, possibly not within reach ever again. He thought about the strange, seductive pull he'd already felt just standing in this village, surrounded by grateful strangers who called him a hero, without asking anything about the war he'd carried on his shoulders back home, without any of the weight of history and prophecy and expectation that had crushed him flat for most of his life. It would be so easy, a small, tired part of him whispered to simply stay, to be strong here and useful and wanted without any of the grief that came bundled with home. He shoved the thought down hard the same way he'd shoved down thoughts of Hermione's face the day before. Not now, not yet. Who is he? He asked instead. The End King. What is he actually? Absalom's wide eyes flicked toward the window, toward the darkening sky outside, as though even speaking the name too loudly at dusk might summon something listening. No one alive has seen him and lived to describe him fully, he said. But the stories agree on some things, that he rules a realm at the edge of everything, a place called the End, where the sky is a void and strange floating islands hang in nothing, and terrible tall creatures called Endermen serve him without question. That he was not always what he is now, that long, long ago, before even my grandmother's grandmother, he was a fallen one himself, just like you, just like the Storm Woman, just like every other lost soul who tumbles into this world from wherever it is you all come from. And that somewhere along the way, instead of trying to find his way home, he decided to make this world his home instead, and to make certain no one could ever challenge him for it. So he's been building an army for how long? Long enough, Absalom said quietly, that villages have stopped counting the years since he first began. Long enough that his Endermen have been slowly, patiently spreading, corner by corner, corner by corner, across land that used to be safe. Long enough that most of us have simply learned to live small and quiet, and hope he never notices we exist. Outside, the light was fading fast, the flat blue sky bleeding orange, and Harry became aware with the same instinctive alertness that had kept him alive through 5 years of war, that the mood in the room had shifted, that Absalom's easy, chatty nervousness had given way to something heavier, something that sat between them now like a held breath. But he'll notice me, Harry said. It wasn't a question. He notices every fallen one eventually, Absalom said. It is only a matter of when. Night fell fast, the way it always did in this world, and this time Harry didn't spend it alone on a defensible outcrop of stone, listening to distant groans in the dark. This time he spent it sitting on the low wooden step outside Absalom's cottage, wand resting across his knees, watching over a village that had, in the space of a single afternoon, become the closest thing to a responsibility he'd had since the war ended. If it had ended, if any of that even mattered any more from wherever he was now standing. The iron golem stood a silent, patient watch a few yards away, having apparently decided, in whatever passed for a golem's mind, that the strange wizard who'd helped defend its village deserved a companion for the night shift. Harry found the company oddly comforting. It didn't talk. It didn't ask him questions he didn't have good answers to. It simply stood and watched the dark, and occasionally turned its blocky iron head toward some sound in the distance that Harry's ears hadn't caught yet, giving him just enough warning to be ready. Around midnight, the sound came again, not a groan, not a rattle, but the low, ambient thrum Harry had noticed on his very first night in this world, a hum in the air that seemed to rise and fall with something almost like breathing. And this time, when he looked up from the village square toward the dark tree line beyond the fences, he saw it. A shape, tall, unnaturally tall, easily 8 feet, thin as a wraith, limbs too long for its body in a way that made Harry's stomach turn cold with instinctive wrongness, standing perfectly still between 2 trees at the edge of the forest, its skin a deep, matte purple-black, its eyes 2 small, glowing points of violet light that seemed to bore straight through the dark and fix, unmistakably, on him. Harry's wand came up. Beside him, the iron golem shifted its weight, a low, grinding creak of metal joints, but made no move to attack, and Absalom's warning from earlier. He notices every fallen one eventually, rang in Harry's ears with sudden, chilling clarity. "Lumos," he murmured, and the light at his wand tip flared brighter, and for one long, taut moment wizard and creature simply stared at each other across the dark, still village square, neither moving, the air between them thick with something that felt disturbingly like observation, like being weighed, measured, filed away for later. Then, without any sound at all, without so much as a rustle of leaves, the creature simply wasn't there anymore. No footsteps retreating. No blur of motion. One instant it stood between the trees, and the next, the space it had occupied was empty, as though it had never existed at all. Harry stood there for a long moment, wand still raised, heart hammering harder than it had during the entire raid. That, he said quietly to no one, was one of his. The iron golem made a low, grinding sound that might, in a golem's limited vocabulary, have counted as agreement. He didn't sleep that night either, though he told himself he'd try. Instead, once the too fast dawn began creeping over the hills, he found himself back at the small forge at the edge of the village, watching the broad-shouldered blacksmith, a villager named Orwin. Absalom had told him, gruff but kind, the sort of person who communicated mostly through the quality of his work rather than his words, hammer away at a length of glowing iron with patient, practiced strikes. "Could you teach me?" Harry asked, when Orwin paused to plunge the metal into a trough of water with a hiss of steam. Orwin glanced at him, said something in that same musical language Harry still couldn't parse, and Absalom, who'd apparently attached himself to Harry's side more or less permanently at this point, translated with a faint smile. "He wants to know why a man who can blow apart raid captains with a stick needs a hammer. Because," Harry said slowly, working the thought out as he spoke, "the stick doesn't work the same way here as it does at home. I don't fully understand what it's turning my magic into yet. And if I'm going to be stuck in a world where the king of the whole place apparently sends spies to stare at me in the middle of the night, I'd rather have more than one way of hitting things back." Absalom translated. Orwin studied Harry for a long moment, the kind of assessing, unhurried look Harry associated with people who'd learned to judge character through action rather than words, and then grunted and held out the hammer. The next hour was, without question, one of the more surreal experiences of Harry's already deeply surreal week. Under Orwin's gruff, mostly wordless instruction, Harry learned through demonstration, through trial, through the occasional pained yelp when he mishandled hot metal, the basic shape of crafting in this world. How a length of wood, chopped from one of the blocky trees with nothing but his bare hands, which had, disturbingly and without any pain at all, simply broken the wood down into neat, portable units, another small piece of evidence that the rules here bent around him in ways he was only beginning to map, could be shaped into a crude workbench, and from there combined with stone or iron in specific, almost ritualistic patterns into tools, pickaxes, swords, armor. "This is mental," Harry muttered, holding up a roughly forged iron sword that had, impossibly, assembled itself into a single solid, balanced weapon the moment he'd arranged the raw ingot pieces correctly on the crafting bench, glowing faintly with that same pale blue shimmer he'd started to associate with the world's underlying logic. I put metal in a grid and a sword came out." "Welcome," Absalom said dryly, "to how everything works here. You get used to it. Mostly." Harry turned the sword over in his hand, testing its weight, and found himself grinning. A real grin, unguarded. The kind he hadn't managed in longer than he wanted to admit. There was something almost giddy about it, standing in a forge in an impossible world, learning to build things with his hands after years of being told, implicitly and explicitly, that his only real value lay in his ability to survive a killing curse and eventually die usefully. Here, nobody knew about the prophecy. Nobody looked at him and saw the chosen one, or the boy who lived, or a weapon to be pointed at a war. Here he was just a bloke learning to swing a hammer, and it felt, for the first time in longer than he could properly measure, almost like freedom. "Careful," Absalom said, watching his face with a shrewdness Harry hadn't quite expected from someone who spent half his conversations panicking about horns. "I know that look. That is the look of a man who is starting to like it here." Harry's grin faded just slightly. "Is that bad?" "It is not bad," Absalom said carefully. "It is only worth remembering that the king likes that look too. It is, I think, exactly the look he is hoping to see in every fallen one who arrives in this world. The look of someone who has found something here worth staying for, and who has started, quietly, to stop looking for the way home." The words settled over Harry like cold water, and he set the sword down on the workbench, his jaw tightening, thinking again of Hermione mid-scream, of Ron somewhere in a battle he hadn't finished, of Ginny's face in a crowd he'd never gotten the chance to search properly. "I haven't stopped looking," he said quietly. "I'm not going to stop looking." "Good," Absalom said with a small, satisfied nod, as though he'd been testing something and gotten the answer he wanted. "Then let us find you a way to look properly, instead of stumbling through forests fighting whatever crosses your path. There is a place not far, 2 days' walk, perhaps less if we take the river route, where the old librarians of this region keep records, star charts, maps of the world's strange places. If anyone knows anything about fallen ones and how they might return home, it will be there." Harry looked up sharply. "You take me there." "You saved my life yesterday," Absalom said, as though this were the most obvious thing in the world. "And my village. And little Nell, who has already decided you are the hero from her favorite bedtime story, which means I am now professionally and personally obligated to keep you alive long enough to disappoint her as little as possible." He paused, and something more genuine slipped through the dry humor, something warmer. "Besides, I have lived my whole life in a small village, watching fallen ones come and go in stories my grandmother told, never once helping any of them, only being afraid of what came looking for them afterward. I would like, for once, to do something braver than running from horns." Harry found himself smiling again, smaller this time, but real. "All right," he said. 2 days' walk, then." 2 days, Absalom agreed. though I would suggest we leave before nightfall today rather than after it. I have had quite enough of your zombie friends for one lifetime, and I suspect they feel the same about you. They left within the hour, provisions packed, bread, dried mutton. A water skin Orwin had grudgingly parted with in exchange for Harry's promise to return and finish learning the forge properly someday. And Nell insisted on walking with them to the edge of the village fence, holding tight to the hem of Harry's robes the whole way, before her father finally, gently, pulled her back and lifted her onto his shoulders so she could wave until they disappeared over the first ridge. Harry looked back once at the little cluster of homes with their pitched roofs, the bell tower catching the last of the afternoon light, the iron golem standing its silent watch at the gate, and felt something in his chest tighten with an ache that was, for the first time since he'd fallen into this world, not entirely grief. It was the ache of leaving somewhere that had, in less than 2 days, started to feel like it mattered. "You are doing the thing again," Absalom observed, falling into step beside him. The look. "Shut up," Harry said, without any real heat, and Absalom laughed, a bright, surprised sound, entirely unlike the nervous chattering he'd done since they'd met. And the two of them walked on together into hills gone gold with the falling sun, leaving the village behind, carrying with them the first real thread of hope Harry had found since the fracture had torn him out of his own world. A library somewhere ahead that might hold the shape of a way home. Behind them, unseen, unnoticed by either of them, a pair of small violet lights blinked once in the deep shadow of the tree line, watched the two figures dwindle into the distance, and then, without sound, without haste, turned and vanished into the dark to carry word of what it had seen to something far older, far more patient, and far more interested in the fallen wizard than either Harry or Absalom yet understood. Chapter 3. Imberjaw's Tribute. The river route, as it turned out, ran along the edge of a canyon that Absalom kept referring to, with a kind of grim, practiced dread, as the Badlands, a stretch of world where the neat green hills gave way abruptly to jagged red and orange rock, striped in bands of terracotta and rust, cut through with dry ravines that plunged down into shadow far deeper than seemed geometrically reasonable for a place built out of blocks. "Why?" Harry asked, on the morning of their second day, watching the landscape shift from soft grassland to something that looked like it had been dropped in from an entirely different painting. "Does it just change like that? No hills getting rockier, no gradual anything. One minute it's grass, next minute it's this." "The world does not believe in gradual," Absalom said, hopping down a short ledge of red sandstone with the easy familiarity of someone who'd clearly made this walk before. "It believes in edges. You will get used to it, or you will not, and it will bother you forever, the way it still bothers me, and we will simply be bothered together." Harry laughed, short and real, and followed him down. The Badlands were quiet in a way that put him on edge, not the alert, watchful quiet of a forest at night, but a heavier, stiller silence, the kind that made the back of his neck prickle with the specific, animal certainty that something was listening even when nothing could be seen. He kept his wand out more than he strictly needed to during the daylight hours, and Absalom, to his credit, didn't complain about it once. "There's a smell," Harry said, around midday as they picked their way along a narrow ledge above a dry ravine. "Sulfur or something like it." "There is," Absalom agreed, and something in his voice had gone tight and careful. "This is bad. This means we are close to a portal." "A portal to what?" "The Nether," Absalom said, and stopped walking entirely, turning to face Harry with an expression that had lost every scrap of its usual chattering nervousness, and replaced it with something flatter, more serious. "Another world beneath this one, not the end, not where the king rules, but a realm of fire and ash where the piglins live. They mine gold there and trade in flesh when gold runs short, and they do not care who you are or where you fell from. To a piglin, you are either tribute or you are fuel. There is no third category." "Lovely," Harry said, And there's one of these portal things near here. There should not be, Absalom said, and that more than anything was what worried Harry most. The should not, the specific wrongness of it, the sense that Absalom's careful, learned map of danger in this world had just been proven incomplete. Portals are old things. Ancient ruins, mostly, left behind by whoever built this land before villagers or piglins or any of us walked it. They do not simply appear. If there is fresh sulfur on this wind, it means someone has built a new one close by, recently enough that the smell has not faded. Harry's grip tightened on his wand. How recently? Absalom didn't answer. He didn't need to, because the answer arrived for both of them at once, in the form of a low, guttural horn blast that rolled up out of the ravine below. Not the raid horn from the Illager attack 2 days ago, but something deeper, coarser, with an edge of something almost gleeful in it, like the sound of predators calling to each other across open ground. "Run," Absalom said. Harry didn't. He'd learned, over 5 years of war, a very particular and very useful skill. The ability to tell, almost instantly, the difference between a threat you could outrun and a threat that was faster than you, hungrier than you, and would simply enjoy the chase before catching you anyway. The horn blast below them had that second quality baked into every note of it, and Harry's instincts, honed by Death Eaters and Dementors and worse, told him plainly that turning his back on whatever was coming would be the single worst decision available to him. "Get behind the rocks," he told Absalom instead, already moving toward the ravine's edge, wand coming up. "And stay there. Whatever happens, stay there. Harry, stay there." Absalom, for once in his life, apparently decided arguing with a wizard mid-crisis was not the moment for his usual chattiness, and scrambled back behind a jut of red sandstone, pressing himself flat against it, wide eyes tracking the ravine below with an expression of pure, undiluted terror. Harry looked down into the ravine, and understood immediately why. They came pouring up out of the shadowed cut in the earth like something spilling out of an ant hill, squat, powerfully built creatures with pig-like snouts and small, glinting eyes. Their skin a mottled pink-gray, dressed in scraps of gold-plated armor that clanked and gleamed even in the dim light, wielding crude swords made of some black, glassy stone that Harry didn't recognize. There were at least a dozen of them, and they moved with the loose, confident swagger of creatures who'd done this exact thing many times before and expected to keep doing it. At the head of the group, mounted on the back of an enormous, snorting boar with reddish, bristled fur, rode a figure who was unmistakably, immediately different from the rest. He was larger than the others, his golden armor more elaborate, etched with patterns that caught the light in ways the crude, functional gear on his followers didn't. A tusk-lined jaw jutted forward beneath small, cunning eyes, and where the other piglins carried simple swords, he carried a long, curved blade that seemed to shimmer faintly with heat, as though it had been forged and never fully allowed to cool. He raised one gauntleted hand, and the horde behind him slowed, then stopped, arranging themselves into a loose semicircle at the base of the ravine, looking up at Harry with the patient, unbothered confidence of hunters who already considered the hunt finished. "Well now," the lead piglin said in a voice that was rough and guttural but disturbingly, entirely fluent, entirely amused. "Look what the wind blew in. A fallen one. Walking right up to my door, no less, when usually I have to go to all the trouble of finding you lot." Harry's wand didn't waver. "You must be somebody important, given the entourage." The piglin's tusked mouth split into something that might have been a grin, if grins on tusked faces looked remotely reassuring, which they did not. "Grix Imburjo," he said, with a small, mocking bow from atop his boar. "Warlord of the Ember Tusk clan, master of 3 portals and more gold than your little wizard mind could count," and his small eyes glinted, soon to be the piglin who finally delivers a fallen one to the End King's court alive, which I am told buys quite a lot of favor these days, given how rare you lot have become. I'll pass, thanks, Harry said. Not really in the market for court appointments. Funny, Grix said, not sounding amused at all anymore. You won't have much say in the matter, little wizard. I've fought your kind before. You burn hot, you burn fast, and then you burn out, same as everything else in this world eventually does. My boys and I have brought down worse than one man with a stick. He is not just a man with a stick. Came a new voice, lower, younger, from somewhere among the ranks of piglins clustered near the ravine wall, and Harry's eyes flicked toward it before he could stop himself, catching sight of a piglin smaller than the rest, standing slightly apart from the group, gold-plated shoulder armor a shade duller than his companions. Small eyes fixed on Harry with an expression that read, unmistakably, as wariness rather than the bloodthirsty eagerness of the others. I saw what happened at the Ashford outpost when one of the fallen ones came through there 3 seasons back. It took 40 of us to bring her down, and we lost half that number doing it. Scarn, Grix said, without turning, his voice going flat and dangerous. Keep your mouth shut, or I'll feed it to my boar. The younger piglin, Scarn, apparently fell silent, but his small eyes stayed on Harry, and there was something in that look that Harry filed away without fully understanding why, some instinct telling him it might matter later. Right, Harry said, to no one in particular, and rolled his shoulders once, feeling the familiar, cold clarity settle over him that always arrived right before a proper fight. The same clarity that had carried him through Death Eater raids and Dementor attacks and the graveyard and the ministry and the battle that had somehow, impossibly, dropped him into this exact ravine. Well, since you've clearly decided this is happening regardless of what I'd prefer, let's get on with it, shall we? Grix and Burjaw's grin came back, wide and confident. Kill him, he said, but keep the head attached. The king wants to see his face. The piglins surged up out of the ravine with a roar, and Harry Potter, who had once faced 100 Death Eaters at once in the corridors of his own school and lived to tell of it, felt something in his chest that was not fear at all, but rather the strange, grim satisfaction of a man finally allowed to stop holding back. Protego Maxima, the enhanced shield charm, bloomed around him in a dome of shimmering blue-white light just as the first wave of black-bladed swords came down, and where an ordinary Protego might have simply held, this one pushed, the pale, half-formed text flickering at the edges of his vision reading something like repulsion field. Force increased before dissolving, and the front rank of piglins were flung backward off their feet, crashing into their own companions in a tangle of gold armor and startled grunts. Harry didn't wait for them to recover. Confringo, the blasting curse tore into the scattered group with a roar of orange fire, and this time, watching for it properly, he caught the flicker of blue text clearly. Blast radius increased, fire damage over time. 2 piglins went down screaming, their armor scorched black, rolling in the dust to smother flames that Harry's spell had apparently decided, on its own initiative, should burn a good deal longer than any ordinary fire. You said he was just a man with a stick, Scarn's voice called out, somewhere behind the chaos, with an edge that might have been dark amusement. Shut up, Scarn, Grix bellowed and spurred his boar forward, curved blade flashing. Harry turned to meet the charge, and here, for the first time since he'd fallen into this world, he found himself facing an opponent who actually knew how to fight, not a shambling zombie, not a mindless spider, but a warlord with decades, possibly centuries of combat behind those small cunning eyes, and Grix's blade came in low and fast, aimed to gut rather than to intimidate. Harry sidestepped, robe snapping, and brought his wand around in a short, vicious arc. Sectum Sempra. He hadn't used the spell in years. Hadn't wanted to, not since the bathroom with Draco, not since he'd understood exactly what damage those words could do to flesh. but some cold, practical part of him had decided, the moment Grix charged, that this particular fight demanded something with teeth. The curse caught the boar across its flank rather than Grix himself, the beast screaming and rearing, and Grix was thrown sideways off its back, hitting the ground hard in a clatter of gold plate. He came up fast, though, faster than Harry expected, blade already swinging, and Harry barely got his wand up in time to catch the strike on a hastily conjured shield, the impact ringing through his arm hard enough to numb it to the elbow. Not bad, Grix snarled, pressing forward, blade flashing in a series of short, brutal strikes that Harry deflected one after another, giving ground step by step across the ravine floor. Most of your kind panic the moment steel gets close. "You've fought with a blade before. You could say that," Harry said, through gritted teeth, and used the momentum of the next parry to spin past Grix's guard entirely, closing the distance instead of retreating from it. A move that clearly wasn't in the piglin's expected playbook, given the flicker of genuine surprise that crossed his tusked face, and brought his wand up hard under Grix's jaw, not casting a spell at all, just using the solid wood the way Sirius had once shown him. A stick to the face works just fine. Grix staggered back, snarling, blood welling from a split lip, and Harry didn't give him time to recover. Incendio! The fire spell caught the warlord's golden armor, and rather than simply burning it, the pale flicker of text read something new this time. Melting. Armor integrity reduced, and Harry watched, with a grim satisfaction he probably shouldn't have enjoyed as much as he did, as the elaborate golden plates across Grix's chest began to warp and run at the edges, the metal itself softening under a heat no ordinary fire should have produced. Grix bellowed, more in fury than pain, and swung his blade in a wide, desperate arc, and Harry ducked under it, came up inside the piglin's reach, and this time didn't hold back at all. Expelliarmus! The disarming charm hit with a force closer to a battering ram than anything resembling its usual gentle effect, and Griximburjaw's curved blade tore itself from his gauntleted grip and spun end over end into the ravine wall, embedding itself in red sandstone with a crack, and the warlord himself was thrown backward off his feet, landing hard in the dust, his half-melted armor smoking faintly. Around them, the rest of the fight had gone very quiet. Harry glanced around and found the remaining piglins standing frozen at various distances, several of them clearly having decided, somewhere in the last 30 seconds, that this particular hunt had gone very wrong very quickly, and were now weighing the relative wisdom of continuing versus retreating in a way that would have been almost funny if Harry weren't still breathing hard, wand hand throbbing where the earlier parry had rattled his arm. "Anyone else?" he asked, and meant it as an honest question. Nobody moved. Grix on the ground made a low, furious sound in his throat and started to push himself up, one hand groping for a knife at his belt, and Harry pointed his wand at him without any particular hurry, the way you'd point at something already beaten, already finished, just making sure it understood the fact. "Don't," Harry said, and something in his voice, flat, tired, utterly without doubt, made even Griximburjaw pause. "You've got a choice here that most of the monsters I've fought never got. Walk away. Take your boys, go back down whatever hole you crawled out of, and don't come looking for me again. Or don't, and I promise you, this ravine becomes a very small, very final place for all of you." Griximburjaw stared up at him, chest heaving, blood dripping from his split lip into the dust, and for a long, taut moment, Harry genuinely couldn't tell which way it would go. Then the warlord spat, turned his head, and barked something harsh and guttural at his remaining warriors, an order unmistakably, and the piglins who'd been standing frozen at various distances immediately began backing away, gathering their fallen weapons, dragging their wounded companions with rough, efficient hands, none of them meeting Harry's eyes. "This isn't finished," Grix said, dragging himself to his feet, cradling one arm that had clearly taken damage in the fall, gold-plated armor still smoking faintly at the edges where the fire had eaten into it. The king will hear of this. You think you've won something today, wizard. You've made an enemy who never, ever forgets a debt. Add it to the list, Harry said. I've got a fairly long one already. Grix bared his tusks in something that wasn't quite a smile, turned, and stalked off toward the ravine, whistling sharply for his wounded boar, which limped after him with a mournful grunt. His warriors fell in behind him, casting wary, resentful glances back at Harry as they went, and within a few minutes the whole raiding party had vanished back down into the shadowed cut in the earth, leaving behind nothing but scorched dust, a scattering of dropped weapons, and a strange, ringing silence. Harry let out a long breath, and only then did he notice that his hands were, in fact, shaking now, not during the fight, never during the fight, but after the way they always shook after, the way 5 years of war had never quite managed to train that particular reaction out of him. Harry, Absalom's voice, tentative from behind the sandstone ledge. Is it, are they gone? They're gone, Harry called back, and slowly, deliberately, made himself breathe until his hands stopped their trembling. Absalom emerged, picking his way carefully down toward the ravine floor, wide eyes taking in the scorched ground, the abandoned weapons, the faint smell of melted gold still hanging in the air, and something in his expression shifted, not quite fear, but something adjacent to it, a recalibration of exactly how much danger the man he'd been traveling with actually represented. You, he said slowly, fought off an entire piglin warband, and their warlord by yourself. Had a bit of help, Harry said, gesturing loosely at nothing in particular, still catching his breath. The world seems to want to make sure I win these things honestly. I don't fully understand why yet. I do not think, Absalom said, that it matters why so much as, he stopped, because a voice had spoken from somewhere behind them, low, uncertain, carrying an edge of genuine fear that hadn't been there when it had first cut through the crowd of piglins earlier. Wait, Harry spun, wand coming up instantly, and found the young piglin Scarn Grix had called him, standing at the mouth of the ravine, alone, hands raised in a gesture that was clearly meant to convey harmlessness, though the black-bladed sword still strapped to his back rather undercut the message. I'm not here to fight, Scarn said quickly when Harry's wand didn't lower. I let them go ahead without me, told them I'd lost my nerve, needed a minute. It wasn't entirely a lie. Why should I believe that? Harry asked, wand steady. Scarn's small eyes flicked toward Absalom, then back to Harry, and something in the young piglin's posture, shoulders hunched, weight shifted slightly back on his heels, the universal body language of someone who very much did not want to be perceived as a threat, made Harry's grip on his wand ease, just slightly, though he didn't lower it fully. Because I've watched Grix send fallen ones to the king's court 6 times now, Scarn said, the words coming faster, like he'd been holding them in for a while and the dam had finally cracked. 6 times. And every single time, the ones who go don't come back the same, if they come back at all. Ashford Outpost, the one I mentioned, that fallen one, the one who took 40 of us to bring down. I saw what she looked like when Grix delivered her to the portal. She wasn't fighting anymore. She wasn't anything anymore, just empty, following orders like one of the king's Endermen. Whatever he does to them in that court, it doesn't just capture them, it hollows them out. Harry felt something cold settle in his stomach. And you're telling me this because... Scarn was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped lower, rougher, edged with something that sounded disconcertingly like shame. Because I'm tired of it, he said simply. Tired of hunting people who never did anything to us, just because Grix says the king pays well for tribute. Tired of watching what happens to the ones we catch. I've been a piglin warrior my whole life, since before I could properly walk, and I've never once questioned any of it. Not until Ashford. Not until I saw what was left of that woman when they dragged her through the portal. He met Harry's eyes, and there was something raw and young in that look, something that hadn't quite finished deciding what kind of creature it wanted to be. You beat Grix and Burjo. Actually beat him, not just survived him, beat him in front of his whole warband. I've never seen that happen before, and I thought, he faltered, glanced down at his own gold-plated boots, then forced his eyes back up. I thought maybe you were someone worth following instead. The ravine was very quiet. Somewhere overhead, a hawk-like bird wheeled once against the flat blue sky and vanished behind a red sandstone ridge. Harry, Absalom said quietly, in the tone of someone offering an opinion he wasn't sure was wanted. For what it is worth, piglins do not typically abandon their warbands. It is not a small thing what he is offering. If Grix learns of this, there will be no mercy for him. Harry studied the young piglin for a long moment. The dulled armor, the wariness in his stance, the way his small eyes kept flicking toward the ravine mouth as though half expecting Grix's warband to come pouring back through it at any moment to punish this exact betrayal, and thought about the war he'd left behind, about how many times he'd had to make the same judgment call about people who'd started on the wrong side and wanted desperately to end up on a better one. He thought of Regulus Black. He thought of Snape, whose loyalty had cost him everything and been questioned right up until the moment it no longer mattered. He thought mostly about how tired he was of assuming the worst about creatures who hadn't been given the chance to prove otherwise. "All right," Harry said finally, lowering his wand the rest of the way. "You can come with us, but the second you point that sword at either of us, I promise you, I'll finish what Grix started and do it a great deal less kindly." Scarn's shoulders dropped, visibly, some tension he'd clearly been carrying since the moment he'd stepped out of that ravine finally breaking loose. "You won't regret it," he said. "I know the nether roots better than anyone in Grix's whole clan. I know where he keeps his gold stores, his portal maps, the outposts he's been building along the eastern ridge. If you're trying to find your way home, I can help. If you're trying to fight the king eventually, I can help with that too." "Let's start," Harry said, "with getting to this library Absalom keeps promising me and go from there." They made camp that night on a shelf of rock overlooking the Badlands, far enough from the ravine that Harry felt reasonably confident Grix wouldn't circle back for a second attempt before morning. And it was there, over a small fire that Scarn built with surprising, practical efficiency. Apparently piglins knew a thing or two about managing flame, having spent their whole lives in a realm built out of it, that Harry finally got the fuller shape of the story Absalom's careful hints had only sketched at. "The king wasn't always the king," Scarn said, turning a stick over the fire, his small eyes reflecting the flame with an odd, thoughtful stillness. "Every piglin knows the old stories, even if we're not supposed to talk about them much. He came from somewhere else same as you, fell into this world same as you did, and for a long time, longer than any of us have records for, he tried to find his way back, built things, studied the old ruins, the portals, the strange writing carved into places even the Endermen won't go near. And then, one day, he stopped trying. What happened?" Harry asked, though some cold, intuitive part of him already suspected the shape of the answer. "Nobody knows for certain," Scarn admitted, "but the stories agree he found something in the end, something old, something that had been waiting there since before the world had names for things. And whatever he found, it didn't send him home. It gave him a choice instead. Power if he stayed. Rulership over everything if he was willing to stop wanting to leave." Scarn's stick crackled in the fire, sending up a small shower of sparks. He chose to stay. And he spent every year since making absolutely certain no other fallen one gets the chance to choose differently. Because a fallen one who actually finds their way home is a fallen one who proves it was possible all along. And the king doesn't like being reminded that he had another option. Harry sat with that for a long moment, staring into the fire, feeling the weight of it settle into the same raw, unhealed place where Absalom's earlier warning had already taken root. Loneliness makes people stay, and understood with a clarity that felt almost like dread, exactly what kind of enemy waited for him somewhere beyond the Badlands, beyond the Nether, in a realm at the edge of the world where the sky was a void and terrible patient creatures served without question. Not a monster. Not really, something worse than a monster, a mirror. He'll come for me eventually, Harry said quietly, same as he came for everyone else. He already knows you're here, Scarn said. Grix wasn't lying about that. Word travels fast through the Nether when a new fallen one turns up strong enough to survive their first few days. The king will have heard of you by now, probably before you even reached Absalom's village. Good, Harry said, and something in his voice had gone hard and certain in a way that made both Absalom and Scarn glance at him with matching expressions of faint alarm. Let him come, then. I'm rather tired of being hunted by people who think they already know how the story ends. Absalom, watching him across the firelight, was quiet for a long moment, and then, softly, in a tone that carried more warmth than worry now, said, "You really do not fear him at all, do you?" Harry thought about it honestly, thought about Voldemort's green eyes across the great hall, about Dementors sucking the warmth out of the world, about a war that had cost him nearly everyone he loved and had somehow, despite all of it, never once managed to make him back down, and found, when he searched himself for fear of some ancient, patient king ruling an empty void full of shadow creatures, that there simply wasn't much there to find. "No," he said simply. "I've met worse, and I outlasted it." Scarn let out a short, surprised huff of something that might have been a laugh, and even Absalom, wide-eyed and nervous as ever, found a small, answering smile. "Then perhaps," Absalom said, settling back against the rock with the air of a man who decided, somewhere in the last few minutes, to stop being quite so afraid, "this world got luckier than it knows, the day you fell into it." Above them, the sky wheeled slowly through its too-fast transition toward full dark, square stars blinking into being one by one, and somewhere far to the east, past the Badlands, past the Nether portal Grix's warband had abandoned in their retreat, past even the farthest edges of the map, Scarn began sketching into the dirt with a stick to show them the safest route toward the librarian's hall. Something ancient and patient in a realm of endless void turned its attention, fully and completely, toward the small, flickering fire burning defiantly against the dark. Chapter 4. The Silence of the End. The librarian's hall turned out to be built into the side of a hollowed-out hill, its round windows glowing faintly gold even in daylight from whatever strange, quiet magic kept its interior lit. And the moment Harry stepped through the arched doorway, he understood why Absalom had spoken of the place with something close to reverence. Shelves rose in curved tiers all the way to a domed ceiling, packed with books that hummed, actually hummed, a low, layered chord of sound that seemed to shift depending on which section of the room Harry stood in, as though the whole building were a single vast instrument being played by unseen hands. An elderly villager in deep purple robes, her wide eyes clouded pale with age, looked up from a lectern at the center of the room as they entered, and something in her expression sharpened the instant she saw Harry, the way a hunting dog's ears prick at a sound too faint for anyone else to notice. "A fallen one," she said, in that same musical, accented English Harry had gotten used to hearing from Absalom, though her voice carried decades more weight behind it. "It has been a long time since one walked through that door and lived long enough to ask a question." "That's rather the plan," Harry said. "Living long enough, I mean." The librarian, her name, Absalom whispered, was Marta, and she had kept this hall for longer than anyone in the region could properly remember, studied him for a long moment, then gestured toward a table near the room's center, stacked with rolled charts and thin, brittle-looking scrolls. "Sit," she said. "Ask. I will tell you what the records hold, though I warn you now, wizard, records are not the same thing as hope. Harry sat. Absalom and Scarn hovered near the doorway, the piglins still visibly uneasy in a space built by and for villagers. And Marta unrolled one of the largest scrolls across the table, a map, Harry realized, but not of the land. Of the sky, dense with strange constellations rendered in careful, faded ink and scattered across it, marked with small red symbols, a scattering of points that Marta tapped one by one as she spoke. Portals, she said. Not the crude nether gates the piglins build with obsidian and fire, those are common enough. Any fool with patience can raise one. I speak of the old ones. Ruins from before villagers, before piglins, before even the End King himself, if the oldest stories are true. Places where the world's skin is thinner than elsewhere. We have found 7 such ruins in our records across 3 generations of librarians. 5 have been searched, mapped, understood as well as any of us understand anything about them. They lead nowhere useful deeper into this world, mostly strange floating islands, empty temples, nothing that answers the question you are truly asking me. And the other 2, Marta's clouded eyes flicked up to meet his. One lies at the heart of the End itself, the king's own realm. No one who has gone looking for it has returned to tell us what they found. She paused. The other lies beneath the sea, in a ruin no living librarian has fully explored, because the currents there are strange enough to drown even those who know how to swim in strange currents, and it has never, in any record we hold, shown signs of leading anywhere but deeper into water and dark. Harry stared at the map for a long moment, feeling the shape of the choice settle over him with the particular, familiar weight of every impossible decision he'd faced back home. Too few good options, all of them dangerous, none of them guaranteed. So if I want a real answer about getting home, he said slowly, I need to go into the End, into his territory, on purpose. That is what the records suggest, yes, Marta said. Though I would ask you to consider, wizard, whether the question you are truly holding is the one you think it is. What do you mean? Marta rolled the star chart closed with slow, careful hands, the gesture of someone who had done this exact motion 1,000 times and found, each time, that it changed nothing about the weight of what the chart contained. I mean that every fallen one who has gone looking for a way home eventually finds themselves asking a second question they did not expect to ask. She said, not how do I leave, but do I still want to? The king understands this better than any creature in this world, because he asked himself that same question once, a very long time ago, and he did not like the answer he gave. I think, perhaps, that is why he has never simply killed every fallen one who crosses into his realm. I think he keeps hoping each time that one of you will finally agree with him. The words landed with an uncomfortable weight, echoing Absalom's warning from days before. Loneliness makes people stay. And Harry found himself thinking, unbidden, of the ease with which he'd learned to swing a hammer at Orwin's forge. The giddy freedom of being just a man with a sword instead of the chosen one. The way Nell's small arms around his leg had loosened something in his chest that grief had kept clenched tight for years. He thought of Hermione's face mid-scream, the moment before the fracture had torn him away. I know what I want, he said, and his voice came out steadier than he expected. I want to go home. That hasn't changed and it isn't going to. Good, Marta said simply, and there was something almost like relief in the word. Then go carefully, wizard, and go prepared, because whatever else the king is, he is not stupid, and he will not let you walk into his realm without offering you every reason in the world to stay. They left the librarian's hall 2 days later, having spent the interim gathering everything Marta's records could offer, rough directions toward the ancient End portal ruin, whispered second-hand accounts of the realm beyond it. A small collection of glowing, faintly humming trinkets Marta insisted on pressing into Harry's hands before they left. enchantments. Wizard, older and steadier than whatever your wand does. Wear this, and it may buy you a breath you would not otherwise have had, and more usefully. Scarn's own knowledge of the terrain, since the young piglin turned out to have actually seen the ruin once, years ago, on a nether expedition with Grix's war band that had gone looking for gold and found, instead, something that had sent even the most battle-hardened piglins in the group running. It's not far past the Badlands, Scarn explained as they walked, sketching the route in broad strokes with his hands. There's a stretch of stone there that doesn't grow anything. No grass, no trees, just gray rock and this strange purple fog that clings to the ground no matter the weather. The ruin sits in the middle of it. Obsidian frame, but not like the nether gates, bigger, older, carved with symbols none of us could read. It doesn't glow purple like a working portal should. It just sits there. Waiting. Waiting for what? Absalom asked, and Scarn shrugged, an oddly human gesture on such an inhuman frame. For someone stupid enough to activate it, probably. Wonderful, Harry said. Sounds exactly like my sort of place. The journey took the better part of 3 days, cutting back through the Badlands and then further east, into terrain that grew progressively stranger the closer they came, the grass thinning, the trees growing sparse and twisted, the sky itself seeming to take on a faint, sickly tinge, toward the horizon that Absalom watched with obvious dread and Scarn watched with the wary familiarity of someone returning to a place he'd hoped never to see again. They camped the final night within sight of it, a low, gray ridge of stone rising up out of a dead, purple-hazed plain, and at its center, unmistakable even at a distance, a towering arch of black, glassy stone, easily 3 times Harry's height, its surface carved with looping, angular symbols that seemed to shift subtly if he looked at them too long, resolving into different shapes each time he blinked. That's it, Scarn said quietly. That's the ruin. Harry studied it in the fading light, feeling that same cold, electric alertness settle over him that he'd learned to trust more than almost anything else in his life. I'm going alone, he said. Absolutely not, Absalom said immediately, with more force than Harry had heard from him since they'd met. You cannot possibly. I have to, Harry said, turning to face them both, and something in his voice must have carried enough weight that even Absalom's protest faltered halfway through. Listen to me. Whatever's on the other side of that portal, it's not a fight I can bring you into. You've seen what the King's Endermen do. You told me yourself, Absalom, that no one who's gone looking for that portal has come back to describe what they found. If I go in there and it goes wrong, I need to know you two are still out here, safe, able to warn the villages, able to keep fighting even if I don't come back. And if it goes wrong for you, Scarn said, who fights for you? No one has to, Harry said, and meant it, feeling the truth of it settle into his bones with the same grim certainty he'd carried into the Forbidden Forest all those years ago, walking to what he'd believed would be his own death, and finding, on the other side of it, that some things were simply worth doing regardless of the cost. I've survived worse than an Enderman King. I plan on continuing to survive worse, but I'm not risking either of you on a gamble I don't fully understand yet. Absalom's wide eyes were wet, though his voice stayed steady when he finally spoke. You had better come back through that thing, Harry Potter. Nell will never forgive either of us if you do not. I'll come back, Harry said, and hoped with everything in him that it was true. The portal up close radiated a cold that had nothing to do with temperature, a deep, bone-level wrongness that made Harry's skin crawl the moment he stepped within its shadow, and the carved symbols along its frame seemed, now that he stood directly before them, to be watching him rather than merely decorating stone. He raised his wand, more out of habit than any real plan, and touched the tip of it lightly to the portal's black surface. The world lurched. There was no dramatic flash, no roar of wind, just a sudden total shift, as though someone had reached out and simply rotated the entire universe 45 degrees while leaving Harry standing perfectly still. And when his vision cleared, the Badlands were gone, Scarn and Absalom were gone, and he stood instead on a small, floating island of pale, cratered stone, suspended in an endless, starless black void. Harry looked up. There was no sky. There was no ground beyond the small island beneath his feet, just void in every direction, vast and silent and utterly without feature, and scattered through it, at distances his eyes struggled to properly judge, more floating islands like the one he stood on, some bare, some crowned with strange, twisted black trees that seemed to shed no leaves and cast no shadow. "Lumos," he murmured, and the light at his wand's tip seemed strangely thin here, swallowed at the edges by the surrounding dark far faster than it should have been. A soft, high sound cut through the silence, not a groan, not a rattle, but something almost musical, layered and strange, like wind chimes made from bone, and Harry spun toward it just as a tall, matte black shape unfolded itself from the shadow of a twisted tree not 10 feet away, violet eyes blinking open one at a time along its narrow face. "You came further than most," the Enderman said, and its voice when it spoke was smooth, cultured, entirely unlike the rough guttural tones of Grix and Berja or the shambling groan of the zombies, a voice that had clearly practiced human speech for a very long time and enjoyed the sound of its own precision. "The king wondered if you would take me to him," Harry said, "since I gather that's rather the point of you being here." The Enderman tilted its head, an oddly bird-like motion, violet eyes studying him with something that might have been amusement. "Direct," it said. "He will like that. Follow, wizard. Try not to look at the void too long. It has a way of looking back." They crossed the end on foot, or something close enough to foot that Harry didn't ask too many questions. The Enderman moved in short, blinking bursts, vanishing from one spot and reappearing several feet ahead in a manner that made Harry's stomach lurch every time it happened, while Harry himself walked the long way across narrow stone bridges that seemed to grow directly out of the void whenever his path required them, vanishing again behind him once he'd crossed. As though the world here existed only exactly as much as it needed to, and not 1 inch more. The islands grew larger the deeper they traveled, the twisted black trees giving way eventually to structures. Not villages, nothing so warm as that, but towers of pale, obsidian-veined stone rising in sharp, angular spires, connected by bridges of the same black glass that formed the portal frame he'd stepped through. The whole architecture built with a cold, deliberate elegance that spoke of centuries of patient, unhurried construction. At the center of it all, on an island easily the size of Hogwarts' entire grounds, stood a palace. Harry had expected, somewhere in the back of his mind, something monstrous, jagged spikes, skulls, the aesthetic of a villain out of a story built to frighten children. What he found instead was almost worse, in its way. A structure of genuine, austere beauty, tall, pale towers catching a light that came from nowhere Harry could identify. Walls carved with the same shifting symbols as the portal, everything built with the kind of careful, obsessive precision that suggested its architect had had nothing but time, and had used every scrap of it. The Enderman led him through a vast entrance hall, its ceiling lost in shadow far above, and Harry became aware, walking through it, of other shapes watching from the darkness between the pillars. More Endermen, dozens of them, silent, still, violet eyes tracking his every step with a patience that felt less like a threat, and more like an audience settling in for a performance they'd been waiting a very long time to see. At the far end of the hall, on a raised dais lit by floating, slow-drifting orbs of pale purple light, sat a throne carved from a single massive block of obsidian, and on it sat a figure that made Harry stop walking entirely the moment he laid eyes on him, because there was nothing monstrous about him either. He looked, more than anything, like a man. Tall, certainly, unnaturally tall in the way of the Endermen around him, though his proportions stayed close enough to human that it read as elegance rather than wrongness, dressed in robes of deep, layered black and violet that seemed to shift and ripple even when he sat perfectly still. His skin pale, almost translucent, laced faintly with the same dark veining that marked the palace stone. His eyes, when he raised them to meet Harry's, were violet, glowing softly, but there was something achingly, unmistakably human in the way they moved, in the small, tired crease at their corners, in the faint, weary smile that touched the corner of his mouth as he watched Harry cross the last stretch of hall toward the dais. "Harry Potter," the Ender King said, and his voice, unlike his herald's cultured precision, carried something rougher underneath the polish, an accent Harry couldn't place, worn smooth by centuries but never quite erased. "I have been waiting rather a long time to say that name out loud to someone who'd actually recognize it." Harry's wand was in his hand, though he hadn't consciously drawn it. "You know who I am." "I know a great many things," the king said. "Word travels, even here, even through a void most creatures fear to cross. A wizard, fallen through some tear in the world's fabric, mid-duel with a dark lord of his own making, defeats an entire piglin warband without breaking a sweat, turns a village's harvest festival into a small legend within days of arriving." His smile deepened, though it never quite reached those tired eyes. "You've made quite an impression for someone who's been here less than 2 weeks. You've been watching me the whole time." "Of course I have," the king said entirely without shame. "I watch every fallen one who crosses into this world, Harry. It is, I confess, one of the few genuine pleasures left to me after so long, watching what you all do in those first frantic days, who runs, who fights, who breaks, who adapts." He rose from the throne, unfolding to his full, imposing height, and descended the dais steps with slow, unhurried grace. "You adapted faster than any I've seen in longer than I care to count. That's rare. That's valuable. That's worth a conversation, wouldn't you say, rather than the rather crude ending my piglin friend intended for you?" "Depends what the conversation's about," Harry said, wand steady, though every instinct in him screamed at the careful, deliberate way the king moved, the sense of a predator that had never once needed to rush anything in its entire long, patient existence. "Walk with me," the king said. "I'll show you." They walked out onto a balcony that jutted from the palace's western face, overlooking the endless drift of floating islands below, and the king leaned against the railing with an ease that felt, disturbingly, almost companionable. "My name once was different," he said, without preamble, staring out into the void. "I won't tell you what it was. It belonged to a life I don't live anymore, in a world I stopped trying to reach a very long time ago. But I fell here the same way you did, mid-crisis, mid-fight, torn out of something I didn't get to finish, dropped into a place that made no sense and cared nothing for who I'd been before I arrived." "Absalom told me the story," Harry said. "Or a version of it, anyway." "Absalom." The king's mouth twitched, something almost fond. "The villager. He talks a great deal, that one, though he's rarely wrong about the important parts." He glanced sideways at Harry. "Did he tell you I offered every fallen one before you the same thing I'm about to offer you?" "He mentioned it." "And did he tell you," the king continued, voice going quieter, more direct, "that some of them said yes?" Harry didn't answer. The king nodded, as though the silence itself was answer enough. "I'm not going to pretend this is a simple choice, Harry, or a foolish one, or one only a monster would accept," he said. "I know exactly how it looks from where you're standing, an ancient tyrant offering a naive stranger power in exchange for loyalty, the sort of bargain every story warns you never to take. But I'd like you to actually consider what I'm offering, rather than the shape of the story you think you're standing inside." "Go on, then." "This world does not want you to leave it," the king said. "That's not poetry, Harry, that's mechanics. You felt it already. The way your magic bends here translates itself into something the world can hold on to and amplify. That doesn't happen to ordinary travelers. It happens because something in the structure of this place recognizes power like yours as useful, as something worth keeping. I felt the exact same pull centuries ago when I first arrived. The world offered me strength I'd never had before, freedom I'd never had before, a chance to simply be powerful instead of constantly bleeding for people who never once stopped needing more from me than I had left to give." Harry's jaw tightened, because the words landed closer to a nerve than he wanted to admit. "I know what that feels like," the king went on, watching Harry's face with an attention that felt uncomfortably precise. "To be so exhausted by the weight of what other people need from you that the idea of simply walking away and being strong instead of responsible feels like the first real breath you've taken in years. I know what it's like to watch a war chew through everyone you love and wonder, quietly in the dark, whether you even want to go back to a world that only ever seems to need you as a weapon." "How do you know that?" Harry asked, and hated how unsteady his voice came out. "Because I asked myself the exact same question in a hall very much like this one, a very long time ago," the king said simply. "And I chose to stop being a weapon for people who'd stopped seeing me as anything else. I chose this, a world where I answer to no one, where nothing can touch me that I haven't already decided to allow, where every single creature in this realm exists because I willed it into being and can unmake with a thought." He turned fully toward Harry now, violet eyes bright with something that might have been sincerity, might have been the most patient, practiced performance of sincerity Harry had ever witnessed. "I'm not offering you servitude, Harry. I'm offering you a throne beside mine, a realm of your own if you'd prefer distance. Power that doesn't run out, doesn't require sacrifice, doesn't ask you to bleed for people who will forget your name the moment the next crisis arrives to replace you in their gratitude." The silence stretched. Somewhere below the balcony, the void drifted, vast and starless, and Harry found himself, despite every instinct screaming at him not to, actually considering it not the throne, not the power, but the exhaustion underneath the offer. The specific, aching truth of watching a war chew through everyone you love, because that was true, that had always been true, and no one back home had ever once offered him the chance to simply stop. He thought of the Great Hall, of the weight of Fred's death, of Sirius's death, of Remus's, of Tonks's, of every single person the prophecy had eventually cost, directly or indirectly, because he'd been born marked for a war he'd never chosen. He thought of how tired he'd been, standing across from Voldemort for the final time, of how some small, treacherous part of him had wondered, in the half-second before the curses collided, whether dying might actually be easier than continuing to survive everyone else's deaths. And then he thought of Hermione's scream, cut off mid-syllable, and the fact that he didn't actually know, still didn't know, 2 weeks into this impossible world, whether she'd survived that final duel at all. "You didn't get an answer," Harry said quietly into the silence. "That's what this is really about, isn't it? Not power, not freedom. You never found out what happened to the people you left behind, and instead of ever finding out, you built yourself a whole world where you'd never have to." The king's expression didn't change, not exactly, but something in his eyes went very still, very careful, in a way that told Harry the arrow had landed closer to true than the king wanted to admit. "That's one way to describe it," he said, voice gone flat. "I don't know if my friends are alive," Harry said, and his voice cracked just slightly on the last word, the first time he'd let himself say it out loud to anyone since he'd fallen through the fracture. "I don't know if Hermione survived that duel. I don't know if Ron's alive, or Ginny, or any of the people I've spent my entire life trying to protect. And you're right, It terrifies me. The idea of going back and finding out the answer might be worse than not knowing terrifies me more than anything you or your Endermen or your piglins or anything else in this entire world could possibly do to me. Then stay, the king said, quiet, almost gentle. Never find out. Build something here instead. Something that's entirely yours, that no war and no prophecy and no grief can ever take from you. Harry looked at him for a long moment, at the tired eyes, the centuries of patient loneliness dressed up as sovereignty, the offer that was, in its own twisted way, genuinely, achingly sincere, and felt something in his chest settle finally into a shape he recognized. No, he said. The king's expression flickered, surprise quickly smoothed away, though not quickly enough to hide it entirely. You're certain? I'm terrified, Harry said, which isn't the same thing as uncertain. I don't know if my friend survived. I might go back and find out the answer is the worst one possible, but not knowing and building myself a comfortable little kingdom to avoid ever finding out, that's not freedom. That's just a different kind of running, dressed up in a nicer robe than the one I'd wear if I actually admitted I was scared. You call it running, the king said, something harder creeping into his voice now, the patient warmth cooling by degrees. I call it survival. I call it choosing yourself, for once, instead of everyone who's only ever seen you as a tool to point at their problems. Maybe, Harry said, but I'd rather be a tool that chooses who I get pointed at than a king who never has to choose anything at all, because I've already decided the world outside my throne doesn't get to matter to me anymore. He held the king's gaze, steady now, the fear still there but no longer in charge of his voice. You've had this whole realm, this whole endless void for centuries, and you still haven't answered the only question that actually matters. Did you ever even try to go back? Or did you just decide it was easier not to, and called that decision strength? The silence that followed was long enough that Harry genuinely didn't know, for several seconds, whether the king intended to answer him at all, or simply have him removed from the balcony by whatever violent means an ancient, centuries-old tyrant might prefer for guests who declined his hospitality too pointedly. You should go, the king said finally, turning back toward the void, his voice gone quiet and strange, some vast, old weariness settling over his features that made him look, for just a moment, less like a king and more like a man who'd been alone for a very, very long time. Before I decide, I don't like the answer you've given me nearly as much as I expected to. Is that a threat? It's a mercy, the king said. I don't extend many. Take this one while it's offered. Harry hesitated, some part of him wanting to press further, to push at the crack he'd found in the king's careful, ancient armor, and see what else might spill out of it. But the colder, more practical part of him, the part that had survived 5 years of war by knowing precisely when to walk away from a fight not yet worth having, recognized the wisdom in the king's words for what it was. This isn't finished, he said instead, echoing without quite meaning to, the exact words Grix and Burjaw had thrown at him in the ravine days before. No, the king agreed, not looking at him. I don't imagine it is. Go home, Harry Potter, if you can find the way, or come back here if you find you can't. Either way, I suspect we'll speak again before the end of things. Harry turned and walked back through the vast, silent hall, past rows of watching Endermen whose violet eyes tracked him without a single flicker of movement, and found the Enderman Herald waiting near the entrance to lead him back toward the small floating island and the portal home. He didn't look back at the throne room. He didn't trust himself, entirely, not to hesitate if he did. The moment he stepped back through the ancient obsidian arch, the Badlands rushed back into being around him, gray stone, purple haze, the cold night air of the overworld replacing the strange, starless silence of the void, and Absalom and Scarn were on their feet instantly, relief flooding both their faces the moment they saw him emerge in one piece. "You're alive," Absalom said, half a question, half a prayer of thanks. "You're Harry, you're shaking." Harry looked down at his own hands and found, with mild surprise, that Absalom was right. Not the familiar post-battle tremor he'd grown used to over the past 2 weeks, but something deeper, older, the specific shake of a man who'd been offered the exact thing he'd never let himself admit he wanted, and had said no to it anyway. "I'm fine," he said, which wasn't entirely true, and both his companions clearly knew it, though neither pushed. "What did he offer you?" Scarn asked quietly after a moment. Harry thought about the throne, the void, the tired violet eyes that had looked, for just a moment, achingly human. "Everything," he said. "Everything I've ever secretly wanted, wrapped up in exactly the kind of excuse that would let me take it without feeling like I'd given anything up." "And you said number." "I said number." Harry looked up at the two of them. The nervous, kind-hearted villager who'd followed him into a battle out of nothing more than stubborn decency. The young piglin who'd walked away from his own clan because he couldn't stomach what they'd become, and felt something steady itself in his chest. Some resolve that the king's offer, for all its careful, seductive weight, had somehow only sharpened rather than shaken loose. "Because I've already got a throne's worth of reasons to keep fighting instead. I just have to actually find my way back to them." Absalom smiled, small and real, and clapped a hand on Harry's shoulder. "Then let us find that way," he said, "before your dramatic pronouncements start attracting more piglins." Somewhere behind them, deep within the void beyond the ancient portal, an ancient king sat alone on an obsidian throne, watching the small, drifting islands of his endless realm with eyes that, for the first time in longer than he could remember, felt the particular, unwelcome ache of a question he had spent centuries very carefully avoiding, finally, unavoidably, asked out loud. Chapter 5. Rent. The message came 3 days after Harry walked out of the inn, carried by an exhausted courier villager who'd run half the length of the Badlands to deliver it, and it arrived in the form of a single scrap of scorched parchment nailed to a fence post outside a farming settlement Absalom's people traded with regularly. Absalom read it first, his wide eyes going tight and grim in a way Harry had learned, over the past weeks, to take very seriously. "It's from Grix," he said. "Or from someone speaking for him, at least. What does it say?" Absalom handed it over without a word, and Harry read the crude, blocky script scrawled across the parchment in something that had probably once been red ink, or possibly, Harry thought with a faint grimace, something worse than ink. "Wizard, you made a fool of me in the Badlands, and I have not forgotten it. I have something you will want. Come to the Emberford stronghold, 3 days travel east of the Sulphur Flats, and bring nothing but yourself if you want her returned breathing. Bring an army and you will only find her in pieces. Her," Harry said slowly. "Who's her?" "I do not know," Absalom said. "But I do not like the shape of this letter, Harry. It reads like a trap dressed up as a rescue." "Of course it's a trap," Scarn said, arms folded, his small eyes fixed on the parchment with the particular disgust of someone recognizing his own former commander's handwriting. "Grix doesn't do subtle. This is exactly the sort of thing he'd do, corner you into walking straight into his stronghold by dangling someone's life in front of you." He paused. "The question that actually matters is whether the bait is real." Harry turned the parchment over, found nothing else written on it, and felt the cold, familiar weight of an old, unwelcome instinct settle over him. The instinct that had once sent him charging into the Ministry of Magic on nothing but a vision and a hunch. The instinct that had gotten Sirius killed and had never, not once in 5 years, stopped him from acting on it the next time it mattered. "It doesn't matter if it's real," he said. "I have to go find out. Harry, if there's even a chance someone's being held prisoner down there," Harry said, cutting off whatever caution Absalom had been about to offer. "I'm not leaving them there because it might be dangerous for me to check. That's not how this works. That's never been how this works." Scarn studied him for a long moment, and something in the young piglin's expression shifted from wariness into something closer to grim respect. "Then we're not sending you in alone," he said. "I know the Imberforge stronghold. I trained there before Grix moved his main operation east. I know its layout, its guard rotations, its weaknesses. If you're walking into a trap, you're at least walking in with someone who knows where the trapdoors are." "And I," Absalom said, drawing himself up with a determination that looked slightly out of place on his usually nervous frame, "am coming too, because someone needs to be sensible while the two of you inevitably do something reckless, and also because I have decided, somewhere in the last 3 weeks, that I am simply done being the one who stays behind." Harry looked between them both and felt, not for the first time, a fierce and unexpected warmth cut through the cold dread of what they were about to walk into. "All right," he said. "Imberforge then. Let's go get her." The Sulphur Flats, when they reached them 2 days later, marked the boundary between the overworld proper and a stretch of scorched, blackened land that Scarn explained was the surface scar left by an old, abandoned nether portal, a place where the boundary between worlds had apparently thinned and warped the land above it, leaving behind a permanent stretch of ash-gray ground where nothing grew and the air itself tasted faintly of ember. "The Imberforge sits just below here," Scarn said, crouching at the edge of a wide, jagged crack in the earth that dropped away into flickering orange light far below. "There's a working portal at the bottom of this ravine. Once we're through, we're in Grix's territory properly, hot stone, lava rivers, fortress walls built from netherrack and bone. If he's telling the truth about wanting a quiet trade, there'll be guards posted at obvious points to make it look civil. If he's lying, and I'd bet good gold he is, there'll be a lot more of them hidden where you can't see them yet." "Wonderful," Harry muttered. "Lead on, then." They descended into the ravine on a narrow, switchbacking path carved into the rock, the air growing warmer and drier with every step, until the portal itself came into view at the ravine's floor, a crude rectangular frame of black, glassy obsidian blocks, its interior shimmering with a swirling, deep purple light that pulsed faintly, almost like a heartbeat. "Once we're through," Scarn said, glancing at Harry, "the rules change. Nether mobs don't behave like overworld ones. Ghasts float and spit fire from a distance. Blazes do the same but worse, and they fly. Wither skeletons hit harder than anything you've fought yet, and their touch carries a curse that eats at you slowly even after the wound's healed. And piglins, well, you know piglins." "I know Grix at least," Harry said, "reasonably well by this point." "Then you know he'll have planned for exactly the kind of fight you gave him last time," Scarn said. "He won't underestimate you twice. That should worry you more than anything else I've just told you." Harry nodded, feeling the truth of that settle into his gut, and stepped through the portal without further hesitation, Absalom and Scarn close behind him. The world on the other side hit him like a wall of heat, thick and dry, and smelling powerfully of ash and sulfur, and Harry's eyes needed a moment to adjust to the strange, ruddy light that bathed everything in shades of deep orange and red-black. Above them stretched a low, oppressive ceiling of dark, craggy stone rather than sky, and below, in every direction, the ground fell away in jagged cliffs and narrow bridges over rivers of slow, glowing lava that lit the whole cavernous realm from beneath like the world's own furnace. "Charming place," Harry said, and Scarn actually laughed, short, surprised, quickly stifled. "You get used to it," he said. "Sort of. This way. The Imberforge is along that ridge." They moved carefully, keeping to the shadows where the strange, craggy stone formations offered cover, and twice they had to freeze in place as winged, ghostly white shapes drifted past overhead. Ghasts, Scarn breathed, keeping his voice to the barest whisper, and Harry watched one of the creatures hang in the ruddy air, its long tentacle-like appendages trailing beneath a squared, papery white body, and felt his skin crawl at the utter, alien wrongness of it. Right up until it opened something like a mouth, and spat a ball of fire that arced across the cavern and detonated against a distant rock wall with a boom that made the whole ravine shudder. "They don't need to see you clearly to hit you," Scarn added once the ghast had drifted on, apparently uninterested in them for the moment. "Best to stay under cover whenever one's in sight." They pressed on, and within the hour the Emberforge itself came into view, a sprawling fortress built into the side of a massive netherrack outcrop, its walls constructed from the same dark, craggy stone as the surrounding cavern but reinforced with black iron and bone, torches burning at regular intervals along its parapets, and piglin guards, armored and armed, patrolling its battlements with the bored, routine confidence of soldiers who didn't expect trouble tonight. "Front gate's a death trap," Scarn murmured, studying the fortress from behind a jagged outcrop of stone. "There's a side passage, though, an old mining tunnel that connects to the lower levels. Used to be a supply route before Grix sealed most of the main entrances after a raid a few years back. If it's still open, it'll get us in without walking past 40 guards." "You know an awful lot about this place," Absalom whispered. "I told you," Scarn said. "I trained here. I know every crack in these walls." The tunnel, when they found it half buried beneath a collapsed section of cliff face, was tight and dark and smelled powerfully of damp stone and something else. Something faintly metallic that Harry couldn't quite place until they'd crawled far enough in that the tunnel opened into a wider, torchlit passage, and he saw, stacked along one wall in neat, orderly rows, cages. Empty ones, mostly. A few with skeletal remains inside that made Harry's stomach turn cold. Remains that had clearly been there a long time, long enough that whatever creature or person had died in them had simply been left, forgotten, part of the fortress's grim decor rather than anything Grix considered worth the effort of clearing away. "Storage level," Scarn whispered. "Tribute holding. This is where they'd keep her if they're keeping her at all." They moved deeper, wands and swords ready, and it was Absalom, of all people, who spotted the light first. A single, flickering torch further down the passage, and beneath it, a cage different from the others. Occupied, its bars newer, sturdier, clearly built to hold something the piglins considered valuable enough to invest in properly. Harry approached carefully, wand raised, and the shape inside the cage shifted at the sound of footsteps, drawing back into the shadows with a wary, defensive motion that was unmistakably, achingly human. "Don't," a voice said, low and rough with disuse but unmistakably a woman's voice, unmistakably speaking English. "Whatever they've sent you to do, whatever Grix promised you, don't. I'm not worth whatever bargain you think you're getting." Harry's chest tightened. "I'm not here for Grix." The shape in the cage went very still. "Say that again," the voice said. "I'm not here for Grix," Harry repeated. "I'm here to get you out. My name's Harry. He hesitated, the word still strange in his mouth even after weeks of practice saying it. "I'm a fallen one, same as you, I think. Got dropped into this world about 3 weeks ago, in the middle of a war I didn't finish. Heard someone was being held here, and I wasn't about to leave without checking." There was a long, taut silence, and then the shape in the shadows shifted forward into the torchlight, and Harry got his first proper look at her. A woman, maybe late 20s, her clothes ragged and travel-worn in a way that spoke of a very long time spent surviving rather than living, dark hair cropped short and rough, like she'd cut it herself with a knife rather than let it grow into something Grix's people could grab hold of in a fight, and eyes that were sharp, assessing, and entirely, fiercely unwilling to trust the sudden kindness standing in front of her. 3 weeks, she said, and there was something bitter and knowing in her voice that made Harry's stomach drop even before she finished the thought. God, 3 weeks. I remember 3 weeks. Everything still feels like it matters when you're 3 weeks in. "How long have you been here?" Harry asked quietly. The woman, Wren, she told him a moment later, Once Scarn had made short work of the cage's crude iron lock with a piglin-forged key he'd apparently lifted off a sleeping guard on the way in, was silent for a long moment before she answered. 2 years, she said. Give or take. Time doesn't run quite the way you'd expect here, and I stopped keeping careful count somewhere around the first year, when counting stopped feeling like it was helping. 2 years, Absalom repeated softly, and something in his wide eyes went stricken. In a cage. Not the whole time, Ren said, climbing stiffly out through the broken door, testing her legs like she hadn't trusted them to hold her weight in longer than she wanted to admit. First year I was free. Fought my way through half this world on my own, figured out crafting, built myself a proper base, even had a decent go at surviving without anyone's help. Grix's people caught me about a year back, during an expedition I probably shouldn't have taken alone. Been his insurance policy ever since, leverage against the king mostly, since apparently his royal voidness gets rather particular about which fallen ones get delivered to his court and which get quietly disposed of for spite. Insurance against the king? Harry asked. What does that mean? Ren's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. It means Grix figured out, a while back, that the king doesn't actually want most fallen ones dead outright, wants them delivered alive. Given the choice he likes to offer, the whole throne beside mine routine. So Grix keeps me around as a bargaining chip, delivers me alive when he needs a favor, threatens to hand me over broken when he wants to remind the king who really controls the trade routes through his territory. It's a whole political game, and I'm just the piece they keep moving around the board. Harry felt something hot and furious rise in his chest, an anger he recognized from a lifetime of watching powerful people treat other people's lives as leverage, as pieces, as things to be moved rather than people to be respected. Not anymore, he said. You're coming with us. Ren studied him for a long moment, that same sharp, assessing look from before, and Harry understood, watching it, that 2 years of captivity and betrayal had taught her to distrust rescue as thoroughly as she distrusted threat. Why? She asked. What's in it for you? Nothing, Harry said honestly. I just don't leave people in cages if I can help it. Never have. Doesn't matter what world I'm standing in. Something in Ren's expression cracked, just slightly, the careful armor of 2 years' survival slipping for a heartbeat before she caught it and pulled it back into place. We should move, she said instead of responding directly. They'll do a head count at shift change soon, and when they find my cage empty, this whole fortress is going to come down on us like a hammer. How soon's shift change? Scarn asked. Ren glanced toward a crude, sand-filled hourglass mounted on the passage wall, an actual timekeeping device, Harry realized with faint surprise, something the piglins had apparently built out of pure operational necessity in a realm with no true day or night. 15 minutes, she said. Maybe less. Then we move fast, Harry said, and turned to lead the way back toward the tunnel they'd come in through. They didn't get more than 20 feet before a horn sounded, deep and rolling, echoing through the fortress's stone passages with an urgency that made every one of them freeze mid-step. That's not shift change, Ren said, voice gone tight. That's an alarm. They must have found the guard I lifted the key from, Scarn said, cursing in a rough, guttural piglin phrase that needed no translation. Faster than I expected. We need another way out. There isn't another way out, Ren said. Not from this level, just the tunnel and the main gate. Harry's mind raced, cataloging options the way 5 years of war had trained him to, and settled within seconds on the only answer that made any sense. Then we make the tunnel work, he said, and I make sure nothing following us catches up before we're through it. The corridor behind them filled with the heavy thud of boots and the guttural shouting of piglin guards within moments, and Harry turned to face the sound while the others sprinted for the tunnel entrance, planting himself squarely in the passage with his wand raised, and a grim, familiar calm settling over his shoulders. The first wave of guards rounded the corner at a dead run, crude swords drawn, and Harry didn't hesitate. Pratigo Maxima. The shield bloomed across the width of the passage, and the lead guard slammed into it at full speed, bouncing backward off an invisible wall with a chorus of startled grunts that would have been almost funny under different circumstances. Confringo. The blasting curse tore through the packed corridor, and Harry watched the pale flicker of blue text confirm what he'd already suspected: confined space, damage amplified, as the explosion contained by the narrow stone walls threw the entire front rank of guards backward in a tangle of scorched armor and pain, shouting. "Harry!" Absalom's voice from behind him near the tunnel. "That's not going to hold them forever." "I know," Harry called back, already backing toward the tunnel himself, wand still raised, throwing off a quick stupefy at a guard who'd recovered fast enough to level a crossbow. "Go! I'm right behind you." He backed into the tunnel mouth just as a fresh wave of piglin reinforcements came pouring around the corner. And this time he didn't bother with anything subtle, simply raised his wand, murmured Bombarda Maxima, and brought a section of the passage sealing down behind him in a roar of collapsing stone and choking dust, sealing the tunnel entrance behind a wall of rubble that would take Grix's soldiers a good long while to clear. He turned and ran, catching up to the others within moments, and they didn't slow until they'd burst back out into the open cavern of the nether proper, lungs burning, hearts hammering, the muffled sound of piglin shouting still audible distantly behind the collapsed tunnel. "That," Scarn said between gasping breaths, "was considerably louder than I was hoping for." "Sorry," Harry said, not sounding sorry at all. "Didn't have time to be quiet about it." Ren, catching her breath against a jagged rock formation, looked at Harry with an expression that had shifted, in the space of the last 10 minutes, from wary distrust into something closer to stunned reassessment. "You brought the ceiling down on an entire company of Grix's guards," she said, "with a stick." "It's a wand, actually," Harry said. "Long story." "I have time," Ren said. "Given that we appear to have just started a war with the single largest piglin clan in this region." They made for the portal at a brisk, wary jog, watching the ruddy sky above for the telltale drift of ghasts. And it was only once they'd stumbled back through the shimmering purple frame into the cool, blessedly ordinary air of the overworld night that any of them properly allowed themselves to slow down. Ren stood in the middle of the sulfur flats, head tilted back, staring up at a proper sky full of square, blinking stars, and Harry watched something in her posture unclench slowly, degree by degree. The particular relief of someone who hadn't expected to see open sky again and was only now allowing herself to believe it was real. 2 years, she said quietly, mostly to herself. God, 2 years and I still forgot what it felt like. "You're safe now," Absalom said gently, and Ren turned to look at him with an expression that was equal parts gratitude and hard-won skepticism. "Safe's a strong word in this world," she said, "but it's better than a cage. I'll take better." They made camp that night in the shelter of a rocky overhang a few miles from the sulfur flats, and it was there, over a small fire and the last of their traveling rations, that Ren finally began to tell her story properly, cautiously at first, testing the waters of trust the way someone does after 2 years spent learning exactly how quickly trust could be weaponized against her, but opening, gradually, as the night wore on and none of her new companions gave her any reason to regret it. "I fell through a car accident," she said, staring into the fire. "Isn't that a stupid way to end up somewhere like this? No epic battle, no ancient prophecy. Just a truck running a red light on a rainy Tuesday, and then I woke up in a forest that looked like it had been drawn by a 5-year-old with a ruler." She laughed, short and humorless. "First few months I actually thought I was dead, thought this was some kind of afterlife or a coma dream or something. Took embarrassingly long to accept that it was just real. A whole real world, running on rules nobody back home would recognize, and somehow I'd fallen into the middle of it. "How did you survive that first year?" Scarn asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "Badly at first," Ren admitted. "Died more times than I want to count in the early days. Turns out this world's got a rather generous policy about letting you come back, so long as you haven't wandered too far from wherever you last slept. But it still hurts like hell every single time, and you lose everything you're carrying when it happens. Learned fast after that. Learned to build, to farm, to fight. Found a village eventually, stayed with them a while, taught myself their language the way I imagine you're teaching yours, Harry, one painful conversation at a time." Her expression darkened. "Then I got restless. Wanted to see more of the world than one village's fences. Went looking for other fallen ones, actually. Heard rumors, same as you probably have, about a king who might know something useful about getting home. Grix's people caught me about halfway there." "Did you ever meet him?" Harry asked. "The king?" Ren's eyes flicked up sharply. "You did, 3 days ago." And her voice had gone very careful, very controlled. "He offered me a throne," Harry said simply. "Told me this world doesn't want me to leave it. Told me I could stop bleeding for people who'll never stop needing more than I have to give." He paused. "I said number." Something in Ren's shoulders dropped, a tension Harry hadn't fully registered until it released. "Good," she said quietly. "That's good. Because I'll tell you something none of the stories about him seem to mention, Harry. I don't think that offer's really about power at all. I think it's a test. I think he's been watching every fallen one who arrives here for centuries, offering that exact same bargain and counting very carefully how many of them say yes. And I think every single yes just confirms for him all over again that he made the right choice all those years ago. That's not generosity. That's a man trying to prove to himself he's not alone in his own mistake. That's more or less what I told him," Harry admitted. "Bet he loved that." "Not particularly, number." Ren allowed herself a small, genuine smile at that, the first Harry had seen from her, and something about the shape of it, tired but real, reminded him fiercely, painfully of Hermione, of the particular way she used to smile when Harry said something that surprised her into actually liking him a little more. "I've got theories," Ren said after a moment, her voice shifting into something more focused, more careful, the tone of someone laying out research they'd spent a long time refining. "About the fracture, about how people like us end up here in the first place, and whether there's actually a way back that doesn't involve begging an ancient tyrant for scraps of information he'll never fully give up." "I'm listening," Harry said, leaning forward. "The old portal ruins," Ren said. "The ones your librarian friend probably told you about. There's more than the 7 she's got mapped. I found evidence of others, out past the eastern deserts, buried under centuries of sand and neglect. And here's the thing that's always bothered me. Every single one of them is built the exact same way, using the exact same carved symbols, regardless of how far apart they are, regardless of how old they seem to be. That's not natural. That's not something that happens by accident across an entire world over however many centuries this place has existed. Somebody built all of them deliberately as part of one connected system. Built by who? I don't know, Ren admitted. But I think the End King does. I think that's exactly the kind of thing his mysterious, something old and patient, told him, back when he found it in the void and decided never to leave. I think the portals aren't just doors between worlds. I think they're part of some much larger structure, something that decides who falls through in the first place. And maybe, if we understood it properly, something that could decide to send us back the same way. Harry sat with that for a long moment, feeling the shape of a much bigger, stranger puzzle settle into place around the edges of everything he thought he'd understood about this world. If that's true, he said slowly, then the king's not just sitting on a throne out of stubbornness. He's sitting on information. Maybe the only real information in this whole world about how any of us actually get home. Which means, Scarn said grimly, sooner or later you're going back to that void. And next time he's not going to offer you a throne out of curiosity. He's going to want to know exactly why you keep saying no and whether that answer's dangerous to him. Let him wonder, Harry said. I've got bigger problems tonight anyway. Such as? Absalom asked. Harry looked toward the dark horizon, toward the sulfur flats and the collapsed tunnel and the furious Piglin warlord who was, even now, no doubt digging his way out of the rubble Harry had left behind and plotting exactly how thoroughly he intended to make Harry regret tonight's rescue. Griximburja, Harry said, is going to be extremely unhappy with all of us, and I don't think a warband is going to be enough to satisfy him this time. Ren's expression across the fire went grim and knowing. No, she agreed quietly. It never is with him. He'll come with everything he's got left and probably a favor or two called in from the king besides, if he's smart enough to realize how badly this reflects on his own authority. She looked around at the three of them, Harry, Absalom, Scarn, with something that looked, for the first time in longer than she probably wanted to admit, like hope rather than mere calculation. But that's tomorrow's problem. Tonight, I'd just like to sit by a fire with people who aren't trying to sell me to anyone, if that's all right. That's more than all right, Harry said, and meant it, feeling the strange, unlikely shape of this found little family settle into place around the fire. A villager who'd never wanted to be brave and had become exactly that anyway. A piglin who'd walked away from everything he'd known because he couldn't stomach what it had made him. A woman who'd survived 2 years of captivity with her spirit bent but never fully broken. And a wizard who'd fallen through a tear in reality and found, against every expectation, something worth fighting for on the other side of it. To getting home, Ren said, raising a battered tin cup of water in a small, tired toast. To getting home, Harry echoed, and the others raised whatever they were holding in turn, and for one quiet, fire-lit moment, the weight of Grix's coming fury and the king's ancient patience and the whole vast, impossible strangeness of this world felt, briefly, bearable, shared, rather than carried alone. It wouldn't last, Harry knew. Somewhere out in the dark, a piglin warlord was already gathering every soldier and every scrap of gold-bought loyalty he had left. And somewhere far beyond that, in a realm of endless void, an ancient king was turning an uncomfortable question over and over in his mind, testing its edges, wondering what to do about a wizard who kept saying number. But tonight, at least, there was a fire, and there were friends, and there was, for the first time since the fracture had torn him out of his own world, the genuine, stubborn beginning of hope that home might not be as impossibly far away as it had felt 3 weeks ago. Chapter 6. The Diamond and the Wand. The purple fog reached Absalom's village 3 days after they left the sulfur flats, and it was Nell who saw it first. She was out past the fences at dawn, chasing one of the chickens that had wandered too near the wheat fields, when she noticed the mist creeping low along the ground at the tree line. Not the ordinary morning haze that sometimes clung to the grass, but something thicker, faintly luminous, with a violet tint that made her small chest go tight with a fear she didn't have words for yet. She ran home screaming for her father, and by the time Orwin came out of the forge with his hammer still in hand, half the village had already gathered at the fence line, staring at a wall of drifting purple mist that hadn't been there the night before, watching with the particular dread of people who'd heard the old stories their whole lives, as small shapes began to resolve within it, tall, thin, matte black, violet eyes blinking open one by one in the murk. They didn't attack. Not yet. They simply stood at the edge of the fog, dozens of them, watching the village the way a held breath watches for the moment to release. By the time Harry, Absalom, Scarn, and Ren crested the final ridge 2 days later, drawn back by a runner sent from the village at a dead sprint. The fog had crept a full half-mile closer, and 3 more villages along the same valley had sent word of the same creeping violet mist swallowing their fields. "He's not testing anymore," Ren said quietly, standing at Harry's shoulder as they looked down at the slow, patient tide of purple mist rolling across land that had been green and ordinary just weeks before. "This is what it looks like when he decides to actually take something." "Why now?" Absalom asked, and there was real fear in his voice, the specific fear of a man watching his own home threatened rather than someone else's. "He has had centuries to do this. Why start now?" Harry thought of the balcony, the tired violet eyes, the crack he'd found in the king's ancient composure. "Because I said no," he said quietly. "And I think that scared him more than anything a warband or a piglin warlord ever could." They didn't get more than a day to plan before Grix and Burjaw found them. He came not with a war band this time, but with something worse. A column of piglins easily 3 times the size of the force he'd brought to the Badlands, gold-plated armor gleaming even under the diffuse, violet-tinted light of the encroaching Ender fog, and marching alongside them, silent and impossibly tall, a full dozen Endermen, their violet eyes tracking the column's progress with the patient, unhurried menace of creatures who had all the time in the world and had simply decided, for once, to spend some of it moving. "He's working with them now," Scarn said, watching the approaching force from the ridge above Absalom's village, his voice tight with something between disgust and grim recognition. Grix would never have accepted Endermen escorts before. He always said they made his boys nervous, upset the gold trade, brought too much attention. Something's changed. "The king's paying better than usual," Harry guessed. "Or he's not paying at all anymore, just ordering." "Either way," Ren said, "that's not a raiding party. That's an occupation force." Below them, the village had already begun preparing. Orwin and the other able-bodied villagers dragging fence posts and cart frames into makeshift barricades at the main approach. The iron golem standing its silent, patient watch at the gate, with a fresh coat of polish on its dented chest plate that some optimistic soul had clearly applied in the desperate hope that it might help, and villagers from 3 neighboring settlements had trickled in over the past day, drawn by word of what Harry had already accomplished once against a raid, hoping, against the mounting evidence of a coming disaster, that lightning might strike twice. "We can't hold a proper siege against that," Absalom said, watching the numbers below. "Not with farmers and 1 golem." "We're not going to hold a siege," Harry said. "We're going to end this before it becomes one." "How?" Harry looked down at the approaching column, at Grix riding at its head on his boar, banner restored, gold armor gleaming, clearly having spent the last week nursing his wounded pride into something sharper and more dangerous than simple anger, and felt the same cold, clear resolve settle over him that had carried him through every impossible fight of his life. "I go meet him," he said. "Alone, in the open, before he reaches the fences. Whatever grudge he's carrying, it's personal. He wants to finish what happened in the Badlands. If I can draw that fight away from the village, away from the Endermen, maybe I buy everyone else enough time to actually prepare a real defense instead of hoping a barricade of cartwheels holds against a dozen ancient shadow monsters." "Harry, that's—" Absalom started. "That's exactly what I'm doing," Harry said, and something in his tone left no real room for argument. "Scarn, you know Grix better than anyone here. Is there any version of this where he doesn't take the bait if I challenge him directly, in front of his own men?" Scarn's tusked mouth twisted into something grim. "Number his pride won't let him refuse, not after the Badlands, not with his own war band watching." "Then that's the plan," Harry said. "You 3 get the village ready for whatever's left of that column once I've dealt with him. I'll handle Grix." He walked out alone into the open field between the ridge and the approaching piglin column, wand loose in his hand, robes, patched now, weeks of travel and battle having worn them down into something closer to practical clothing than the ceremonial dueling robes he'd worn at Hogwarts, snapping faintly in the dry wind, and stopped 100 yards from Grix's advancing line, standing his ground with the unhurried, deliberate stillness of a man who had absolutely no intention of running. Grix reined his boar to a halt at the sight of him, small eyes narrowing, and raised a gauntleted hand to bring his whole column grinding to a stop behind him. "You've got some nerve," Grix called across the distance, "standing out here in the open, all alone after what you did to my tunnel." "You've got some nerve," Harry called back, "bringing an army to a village full of farmers because I embarrassed you in front of your own boys once. Thought warlords were supposed to be above that sort of thing." Grix's tusked face twisted into something ugly. "This isn't about pride anymore, wizard." Words gotten out, all the way to the king's own halls, that Grix and Burjo let a fallen one's rescue party walk out of his own fortress with his prize insurance policy in tow. "My clan spent a week fending off challengers who think that means I've gone soft. I need this. I need every soldier in that village to watch me put you in the ground, or I lose everything I've spent decades building." "That's the thing about power built on fear," Harry said. "It's exhausting to maintain. Every single day someone new wants to test whether you're still as dangerous as you used to be." "Careful," Grix growled. "That sounds like something you'd say if you actually understood the first thing about ruling anything." "Maybe I don't," Harry said. "But I understand something else. I understand that you've got two options here, same as you did in the Badlands. Walk your column back the way it came, and we both walk away from this without anyone else dying today. Or don't, and I promise you, this ends exactly the way it did last time, except this time I'm not feeling especially generous about where the line gets drawn." Grix's small eyes flicked briefly toward the Enderman standing silent and patient at the rear of his column, and something in that glance, a flicker of unease, quickly suppressed, told Harry everything he needed to know about how comfortable the warlord actually felt about his new allies. "No," Grix said finally, dismounting his boar with a heavy, deliberate motion, drawing his curved blade, its edge shimmering faintly with restrained heat. "No, wizard. This ends with your head on my banner pole in front of every soldier who's doubted me this week, and then my clan goes right back to being the most feared name in this region." "Have it your way, then," Harry said, and raised his wand. The duel that followed was shorter than the one in the Badlands, and considerably more one-sided. Grix came in fast, blade flashing, clearly having spent the intervening week training specifically against the memory of everything Harry had thrown at him the first time. And for the first 30 seconds, he actually managed to press Harry back several steps, curved steel ringing off hastily conjured shields, forcing Harry to give ground in a way he hadn't needed to before. But Grix was fighting the fight he remembered, and Harry had spent the last 3 weeks learning to fight the fight this world actually offered him. Glacius. Harry hadn't cast the spell before, wasn't entirely sure, honestly, whether it existed in proper wizarding vocabulary, or whether he'd half-invented it out of desperate improvisation. Some blend of freezing charm and elemental will. But the burst of pale blue frost that erupted from his wand tip caught Grix's next swing mid-arc, and the pale, flickering text that bloomed and vanished above the impact red frost aspect, movement slowed, and Grix's blade, suddenly sluggish, arrived a half-second too late to catch Harry, who'd already pivoted out of its path. "What?" Grix started, staring down at his own arm at the faint rime of frost creeping across his gauntlet, slowing every motion by some crucial, fatal fraction. Harry didn't give him time to finish the thought. "Expelliarmus." The disarming charm tore the curved blade from Grix's slowed grip with brutal, battering force, sending it spinning end over end into the dirt, and before the warlord could recover, Harry closed the distance and swept his legs out from under him with a spell he'd learned from Scarn's own crafting lessons. Not magic at all. This time, just a solid, well-placed strike with the flat of his boot that any soldier back home would have recognized. Grix hit the ground hard, gasping, and Harry stood over him with his wand pointed at his throat, breathing steady, expression flat and cold in a way that carried the weight of every hard lesson 5 years of war had taught him about mercy and its limits. "Same offer as last time," Harry said. "Walk away, take your column home, or this ends here permanently in front of every soldier you brought to watch." Grix stared up at him, chest heaving, and for a long moment Harry genuinely believed the warlord might finally choose the smart answer. Then Grix's hand, moving faster than his slowed, frost-rimed limbs should have allowed, snatched a small, dark object from his belt, a shard of black glass, glowing faintly at its edges, and hurled it not at Harry but at the sky above him, and the object detonated in a burst of violet light that Harry recognized with a lurch of cold understanding half a second too late. A signal flare. Ender touched. "You should have taken the offer," Harry said quietly, and there was real regret in his voice, the specific regret of a man who genuinely hoped, one more time, for a better outcome than the one he was about to deliver. "Confringo," he murmured, and this time he didn't hold anything back. The blast took Grix and Burjaw full in the chest, and the warlord who had built an empire on gold and fear and the suffering of everyone weaker than himself did not get back up. Above them, in answer to the flare's violet burst, the fog line along the tree line surged forward, and the Endermen who had stood patient and silent throughout the whole duel finally, all at once, began to move. The battle that followed was unlike anything Harry had fought since he'd fallen into this world. Not the chaotic scramble of a raid, not the focused intensity of a single duel, but something closer to the pitched, sprawling desperation of the Battle of Hogwarts itself. And standing in the middle of it, wand raised against a tide of blinking, teleporting shadow creatures, Harry felt something in his chest settle into a grim, familiar rhythm he hadn't realized, until this exact moment, that he'd actually missed. The Piglin column, leaderless after Grix's death, broke into confused, scattered retreat within minutes, most of them apparently having joined the expedition more out of obligation to their warlord than any genuine loyalty to the Ender King's larger cause. And Harry let them go, focusing everything he had on the true threat still advancing. A dozen Endermen, then more, pouring out of the violet fog in numbers that hadn't been visible from the ridge, easily 3 dozen of the tall, silent creatures converging on the village's makeshift barricades. "Harry," Ren's voice cutting through the chaos, and he turned to find her fighting alongside Scarn near the main gate, a crude iron sword in her hand that she wielded with the rough, practical efficiency of 2 years' hard-won survival, while Scarn's black-bladed Piglin weapon carved a bloody, decisive arc through the front rank of Endermen pressing toward the barricade. "There's too many. We can't hold the whole perimeter." "Fall back to the well," Harry shouted back, already moving. "Tighten the circle, don't let them surround you." He crossed the village square at a dead run, wand snapping through spell after spell, Confringo scattering a knot of Endermen that had teleported dangerously close to a cluster of sheltering villagers, Pratigo Maxima throwing up a shield around a family caught in the open, Stupefy dropping an Enderman mid-blink before it could finish its teleport and strike the iron golem from behind, and everywhere he moved, the pale flicker of half-formed text bloomed and vanished at the edge of his vision. The world itself apparently working overtime to translate the sheer volume of magic he was throwing into something it could categorize, hold, amplify. Overwhelm bonus, consecutive casts empower, area denial, enemy movement restricted, battle fury, casting speed increased. He didn't fully understand what any of it meant, not in any technical sense, but he understood viscerally that every spell was landing harder and faster than the last, that some deep, structural logic in this world had decided, in the middle of the single largest fight he'd faced since arriving, to simply let him become as dangerous as he was capable of being. And Harry Potter, who had spent most of his life being told to hide his power, to temper it, to be careful, to be humble, to never let anyone see quite how much he was actually capable of, Harry Potter let himself, finally and completely, stop holding back. Bombarda Maxima, a cluster of 6 Endermen converging on the iron golem's exposed flank, went up in a single roaring blast that scattered them like leaves in a storm. Incendio, a wall of fire, sustained and merciless, cut off an entire approach lane toward the well where the villagers had gathered. Fulgur, a spell he'd never properly cast before, something between a lightning charm and pure desperate improvisation, and the bolt of white-blue energy that tore from his wand tip, arced between 3 separate Endermen in a single, chaining strike that left all 3 convulsing and dissolving into scattered ender particles before they hit the ground. The iron golem, freed from the flanking pressure Harry's spellwork had cleared, waded into the remaining Endermen with the slow, unstoppable momentum of a landslide, massive iron fists crushing through shadow-black limbs with a series of impacts that shook the ground. And Orwin, standing at the golem's side with a hammer of his own in hand, fought with a grim, practical fury that made it clear he'd been waiting his entire life for a chance to properly defend the home he'd spent decades building. Within 20 minutes, the last of the visible Ender force had either been destroyed or, in a few scattered cases, simply teleported away into the retreating fog, and Harry stood in the wreckage of the village square, chest heaving, robes scorched at the edges, and felt the strange, hollow quiet that always followed a fight this size, the specific silence of a battlefield taking stock of what it had cost. "We held it," Absalom said, arriving at his side with a scrape along one cheek and an expression of dazed, exhausted relief. "Harry, we actually held it." "For now," Harry said, looking toward the horizon, toward the distant, still lingering violet haze that hadn't retreated nearly far enough for his liking. "That was a scouting force, a test. He's going to come himself next time or send something a great deal worse." Ren, limping slightly, a shallow cut along her forearm that she'd already bound with practiced efficiency, came to stand on his other side, following his gaze toward the horizon. "You're right," she said quietly. "And I think I finally understand why." "What do you mean?" "I found something," she said, "while you were fighting Grix. In the chaos, one of the retreating piglins dropped a satchel. Grix's personal effects, probably, things he'd have kept close, things important enough to carry into a fight." She reached into her own pack and produced a small, heavy object wrapped in scorched cloth, unwrapping it carefully to reveal a shard of deep violet crystal, faintly humming, its surface etched with the same shifting symbols Harry had seen carved into the ancient portal frame in the Badlands. "This isn't nether glass. This is end crystal." Grix wasn't just working for the king out of fear of retribution, Harry. He was being paid in fragments of something real, something the king's been slowly distributing to his allies across the whole region. "I think this is a piece of whatever anchors the king's power to this world. I think if we understood how it worked, it might actually tell us how to reach the deep end portal, the real one, the one that leads home instead of the one you already walked through." Harry stared at the crystal, feeling the shape of an idea take root, dangerous, uncertain, but real. "Then we need to find out exactly what it does," he said. "Because if the king's escalating this fast, this openly, we're running out of time to figure out the difference between fighting him off and actually ending this." They didn't have long to study the crystal. 2 days later, at dusk, the sky itself began to change. It started subtly, a faint violet tinge creeping into the edges of the flat blue horizon, the too fast sunset arriving even faster than usual, streaked through with color that had no business belonging to an ordinary sky. And by the time full dark fell, the square, familiar stars had begun to blink out, one by one, swallowed by a spreading, star-eating void that crept across the heavens like ink spilled into water. "He's not sending scouts anymore," Scarn said, standing beside Harry on the village's low defensive rise, watching the sky consume itself. "That's not a raid. That's the end itself spreading." "Can he actually do that?" Absalom asked, voice tight with a fear that had gone past panic into something quieter, more resigned. "Bring his whole realm here." "I don't think he's ever tried before," Ren said grimly. "I think you scared him badly enough, Harry, that he's decided the safest answer isn't recruiting fallen ones one at a time anymore. I think he's decided the safest answer is making sure there's no overworld left to want to go home to." Harry felt something cold and clear settle into his chest, the specific, familiar clarity of a man who had run out of smaller options and understood, without needing anyone to explain it further, that only one path remained. "Then I go to him," he said. "Now, tonight, before that void finishes swallowing the sky over every village in this region." "Harry, I'm not asking permission, Absalom," Harry said, gently but with an edge of iron underneath it. "I've spent 3 weeks in this world learning exactly what I'm capable of, and I've been holding back more than I even realized, because some part of me kept expecting to wake up and find myself back in a world where I had to be careful, where being too powerful got people looking at me the wrong way." He looked out at the spreading void, swallowing star after star, and felt the last of that old caution simply burn away. "Not anymore. If he wants a war, I'll give him one he actually has to fight properly, instead of one he can win by attrition and patience." "You're not going alone," Ren said, and there was no room for argument in her voice either. "I've survived 2 years in this world specifically so I could be useful for a moment exactly like this one. I'm not sitting it out." "Nor am I," Scarn said. "I left my whole clan behind for this. I'm not stopping now." "Nor I," Absalom said, drawing himself up, wide eyes steady despite the visible tremor in his hands. "I told you once I was done being the one who stays behind. I meant it." Harry looked around at the 3 of them, the found family that had grown, without his quite noticing it happen, from a chance encounter in a forest into something that felt, standing here on the edge of an actual apocalypse, worth more than anything Voldemort's war had ever asked him to protect, and felt something in his chest ache with a gratitude too large for words. "All right," he said. "Then let's go end this." They reached the Badlands portal by midnight, the void overhead now covering fully half the visible sky, and stepped through the ancient obsidian arch together, emerging on the far side into a realm that had changed dramatically since Harry's first visit. The floating islands crowded closer together now, the twisted black trees grown thicker, and everywhere, in every direction, Endermen gathering in numbers that dwarfed anything Harry had seen in the throne hall weeks before. They didn't attack. They simply watched, violet eyes tracking the small group's progress across narrow, self-generating bridges of stone, and Harry understood with grim certainty that the king had known the exact moment they'd step through the portal, and had chosen for now to let them come. The throne hall, when they reached it, looked exactly as it had before, vast, austere, lit by slow-drifting orbs of purple light, except that this time the king did not sit upon his obsidian throne. He stood before it, robes shifting like living shadow, violet eyes fixed on Harry with an expression that had lost every scrap of the tired, patient warmth from their first conversation. "You brought company this time," the king said. A villager, a defector, and his gaze settled on Ren, and something flickered across his ancient features that might have been recognition, might have been regret. "The Emberforge prisoner. I'd wondered what became of her." "You knew about that too," Ren said, voice hard. "I know everything that happens in my world," the king said simply. including, apparently, that a wizard who told me he wasn't interested in power has spent the last several weeks becoming exactly powerful enough to threaten everything I've spent centuries building. His eyes returned to Harry, and there was genuine, weary anger in them now, underneath the ancient composure. You should have taken the throne, Harry Potter. It would have been so much simpler for both of us. You're doing this because I said no, Harry said. Because as long as I'm out there, alive, refusing your offer and still surviving anyway, I'm proof that leaving was always possible for you too, and you never had to build any of this. Careful, the king warned, voice gone low and dangerous. No, Harry said, and stepped forward, wand rising, feeling the full, unrestrained weight of everything this world had taught him settle into his chest like a held breath finally released. I've been careful my entire life. Careful about my power, careful about what people expected of me, careful about how much of myself I was allowed to show before it frightened someone. I'm done being careful. You want to erase an entire world's worth of villages and farms and children, because one wizard hurt your pride by refusing a throne. Then you'd better be ready for exactly how much of myself I'm about to show you. The king's expression flickered, surprise quickly masked, though not quickly enough, and then, without another word, he raised one pale hand, and the Endermen crowding the hall's shadowed edges surged forward as one. Harry didn't wait for them to reach him. Bombarda Maxima. The blast tore through the front rank in a roar of fire and force, and the pale, flickering text that bloomed above the impact read something Harry had never seen before. Divine wrath, damage doubled, and he understood, in that instant, exactly how far this world's strange, translating logic was willing to let him go, now that he'd finally stopped holding anything back. Ren fought at his side with the ferocious, practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent 2 years learning to survive exactly this kind of chaos, her iron sword carving through Enderman after Enderman with brutal economy. Skarn's black blade moved with the trained precision of a warrior who'd spent his whole life among monsters and had finally chosen, decisively, which side of that line he wanted to stand on. Absalom, unarmed but far from useless, dragged wounded villagers. No, Harry realized with a startled jolt, not villagers, but the handful of fallen ones the king had apparently kept in his hall as attendants over the centuries, dazed and hollow-eyed just as Skarn had described, some flicker of recognition sparking in their vacant expressions at the sight of actual, desperate rebellion happening around them. Out of the path of the fighting with a courage that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with refusing, one more time, to be the one who stayed behind. Harry fought his way through the hall toward the king himself, spell after spell tearing through the ranks of Endermen between them, and the king, watching him come, finally stepped down from beside his throne to meet him properly, robes of shadow rippling, violet eyes burning with centuries of accumulated fury and grief and loneliness, all finally, catastrophically, given somewhere to go. You want to know what I really found in this void before I chose to stay? The king said, voice carrying across the chaos of the battle with unnatural clarity. I found the truth, Harry Potter, that no matter how hard you fight, no matter how many people you save, eventually the world stops thanking you and starts simply expecting more. I found freedom from that expectation. And you've just spent 3 weeks proving to every fallen soul in this world that freedom was never actually necessary, that you can keep bleeding for people forever, and somehow, impossibly, still call it a life worth living. It is, Harry said simply, wand raised, standing his ground as the king raised both hands, violet energy crackling between them. That's exactly what it is. I'm not fighting you because I hate you. I'm fighting you because you're wrong. And because an entire world full of people who never asked for any of this are about to pay for your mistake if I don't stop you. The king's answering blast came fast and merciless, a bolt of pure void energy that tore through the space between them, and Harry threw up his shield on pure instinct, feeling the impact rattle through his bones. The pale flicker of text reading barrier overload critical strain, a warning, unmistakably, that whatever the king was throwing at him existed on a different scale entirely from anything Harry had faced yet in this world. He held the shield anyway, because he'd held worse against worse for longer, and he wasn't about to stop now. Expelliarmus! He shouted, pouring everything he had left into the single word, and the disarming charm, amplified by 3 weeks of translation and adaptation, amplified further by the desperate, absolute conviction behind it, tore across the hall not as a gentle, disarming pulse, but as a battering wave of pure force that struck the king full in the chest and threw him backward off his feet, sending him crashing into his own obsidian throne hard enough to crack the ancient stone. Silence fell across the hall. The remaining Endermen, watching their king sprawled and stunned at the foot of his own throne, froze in place, some ancient instinct clearly warning them against acting without his direction. Harry crossed the hall slowly, wand still raised, and stopped a few feet from where the king lay, breathing hard, robes of shadow pooled around him like spilled ink. "You could end this," the king said quietly, looking up at him. "Right now. I'm not going to pretend I don't understand the mercy you're capable of, Harry Potter. I've watched you offer it to everyone else who's crossed your path in this world. Grix Imburgo, my own Enderman, who never asked to serve me any more than the piglins asked to serve him. I'm not going to kill you," Harry said, and lowered his wand just slightly. "Because I don't think that's actually what ends this. I think what ends this is you finally admitting, out loud in front of everyone in this hall, exactly what you told me on that balcony 3 weeks ago, that this whole kingdom was never about strength. It was about avoiding a question you were too afraid to answer." The king was silent for a long moment, staring up at him, and something in his ancient, tired eyes finally, visibly cracked. "I never went back," he said quietly, the words dragged up from somewhere buried deep enough that even centuries hadn't fully smoothed them over. "I never even tried. I told you I chose this world instead of finding out what happened to the people I left behind. That was a lie, Harry. The truth is simpler and worse. I was afraid to try and afraid to fail, and it was easier to build an empire out of that fear than to ever face it honestly." He let out a long, shuddering breath. "You walked through my realm not once but twice now, and both times you chose the harder, more frightening path, instead of the easy one I offered. I don't think I have the strength left to keep pretending that doesn't matter." "It matters," Harry said quietly. "It's the only thing that ever really has." The void overhead, when they emerged back through the Badlands portal hours later, had already begun to retreat, the swallowed stars blinking back into being one by one, the creeping violet fog withdrawing from the fields and villages it had touched, and word would reach them over the following days that the king's remaining forces across the whole region had simply stopped, withdrawn, gone quiet in a way that felt less like victory and more like a held breath finally, cautiously released. The king hadn't surrendered, not exactly. He'd retreated into his void with the shattered pieces of his throne and centuries of unanswered questions, and Harry suspected, with a certainty that felt more like grim hope than fear, that this wasn't truly finished, that somewhere in that endless dark, an ancient, lonely creature was finally, after centuries, sitting with the question he'd spent so long avoiding, and that whatever came of that reckoning, it wouldn't be simple and it wouldn't be soon. But for now, the fog was retreating. The villages were safe, and Wren's crystal, studied properly in the days that followed with the combined knowledge of Marta's librarian records and Scarn's hard-won understanding of the old ruins, had finally, quietly, revealed its secret. A working key, carved with symbols that matched precisely the deep, ancient portal buried at the heart of the end, the one no living fallen one had ever successfully activated. They stood before it together, weeks later, on a floating island deep within a void grown calm and quiet in the king's long absence. Harry, Ren, Absalom, Scarn, watching the portal frame hum and shimmer with a light unlike any Harry had seen before. Pale gold rather than violet, unmistakably, achingly familiar in a way that made his chest tighten with 3 weeks' worth of buried grief and longing all at once. "This is it," Ren said quietly. "This is really it, isn't it?" "It is," Harry said, staring into the shimmering gold light, feeling the pull of home, actual home, Hermione and Ron and Ginny, and everyone he'd left behind mid-battle without so much as a goodbye, settle over him with a weight that nearly buckled his knees. "You should go," Absalom said, though his voice cracked on the words. "Whatever waits for you there, Harry, it is waiting. It has been waiting 3 weeks already." Harry looked at the portal, and then at the 3 people standing beside him, a villager who'd found more courage than he'd ever believed himself capable of, a piglin who'd chosen, against everything he'd been raised to believe, to become something better than his clan, a woman who'd survived 2 years of captivity and come out the other side sharper and kinder rather than broken, and felt the shape of his own answer settle into place with a certainty that surprised him. "I am going," he said. "But not forever, not yet." He looked at the portal, at the pull of it, undeniable and real. "I need to know if they're alive. I need to see my own world again, even if just for a little while, even if it terrifies me more than anything I've faced here. But this world's still healing from what the king spent centuries building, and Grix's clan hasn't finished falling apart, and Absalom's village needs someone who knows how to rebuild a proper defense before the next threat comes looking." He turned to face them fully. "So I'm going home, and then I'm coming back. Both of those things are true, and I'm done pretending I have to choose only one." Ren's smile, when it came, was small, tired, and entirely real. "Then we'll be here," she said. "When you do." Harry stepped toward the shimmering gold light, feeling 3 weeks of impossible adventure settle into something that finally felt, for the first time since the fracture had torn him out of the Great Hall, like a story with room left to continue rather than end, and stepped through, carrying with him the wand that had rewritten itself into something new in this strange, blocky, infinite world, and the fierce, certain knowledge that wherever he ended up next, home or otherwise, he would never again let himself be careful about how much of himself he was willing to show.